We had been looking forward to this trip for months. A break from the noise of everyday life, a chance to reconnect as a family, to breathe in the salty air and feel the sand between our toes. Our camper was parked just off a barely visible track used by other beachgoers, but it still felt secluded. The ocean stretched endlessly before us, its waves crashing rhythmically, a constant backdrop of white noise. The wind was relentless, rattling the camper's awning and whistling through any small opening it could find. The nearest camper was more than a quarter-mile away in one direction, and in the other, nothing but miles of empty coastline. No cell service, no streetlights, no nearby roads, just us and the elements. By the second day, we had settled into an easy routine. My husband and our two older kids had to drive back to town for supplies, leaving me and our youngest, Jake, alone at the campsite. It wasn't a big deal, we had everything we needed for a few hours. Jake was perfectly content splashing around in the waves while I sat in my beach chair, book in hand, glancing up every so often to check on him. The occasional truck passed, looking for a fishing spot, kicking up sand in its wake before disappearing down the beach. Then a small red pickup rolled by. The driver, a middle-aged man with sun-weathered skin, waved. I returned the gesture without much thought and went back to my book. A little while later, the same truck came back, this time in the opposite direction. Again, the driver waved. This time, something about it stuck in my mind. It wasn't unusual for people to drive up and down the beach, but this guy had already been by once. Maybe he was just looking for a spot, but my gut told me otherwise. Not long after, the truck came back and stopped between me and the shoreline, blocking my view of Jake. That's when the unease turned into something heavier, something I could feel pressing against my ribs. I stood up, angling myself so I could see my son just past the truck's hood. The driver rolled down his window and smiled. He started asking questions, harmless on the surface but far too detailed. How long you out here? Where you coming from? Where's your husband? Each question made my stomach tighten. I answered vaguely, lying when I had to. I didn't want to be rude, didn't want to anger someone when I had no way to call for help. The man kept chatting, leaning on his door like he had all the time in the world. The wind whipped at my hair, the ocean roared behind me, and yet, I had never felt more vulnerable. Finally, he left, drove down the beach like he was just another camper looking for a place to park. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I tried to settle back into my book, but I kept glancing up, scanning the horizon for any sign of that truck. Sure enough, maybe 30 minutes later, it returned. This time, he stopped again, rolled down his window and called out, "Looks like you got the best spot on the beach. Maybe I'll bring my kids down later, let them play with yours." There was something in his voice, something in the way he looked at me. My skin crawled. He left again, but I wasn't gonna wait to find out if he'd be back. I gathered Jake up, brought him inside the camper, and locked the door. My hands shook as I dug through our safe, pulling out the handgun we always kept for emergencies. I checked the safety, made sure it was loaded, and kept it within reach. Every noise outside made my breath hitch. The wind howled, shaking the camper, but I kept imagining the sound of tires crunching over sand, a door slamming, footsteps approaching. I peeked through the blinds, scanning the beach. Nothing. Minutes dragged, then hours. My husband and the kids were supposed to be back before dark. The sun started to sink lower, turning the sky into a watercolor of orange and deepening blue. Then headlights in the distance. A truck, but I couldn't tell what color. It was moving slow, creeping toward us. I gripped the gun. My heart pounded. The truck got closer. My stomach lurched. The red paint reflected in the fading sunlight. I held my breath, but instead of stopping, it kept rolling. Slow, deliberate. The driver didn't wave this time, just stared as he passed, his face shadowed by the setting sun. And then he was gone. I kept watching until the last hint of his taillights disappeared over the horizon. When my husband finally pulled up, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I burst into tears, the tension unraveling all at once. I told him everything. He didn't ask questions. He didn't tell me I was overreacting. Instead, he checked his gun, locked the camper up tight, and sat up all night watching the road, listening. The red truck never came back, but we cut our trip short the next morning. I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't trusted my gut, if I had ignored that uneasy feeling, if I hadn't locked the door, if I had let Jake keep playing outside just a little longer. I don't like to think about it too much, but I know one thing: I'll never camp that far out alone again. Not ever. The summer of the Second Crow War was a quiet one at first. I had just turned 32, and my husband and I were settling into a new routine after the loss of our old dog, Max. He had been with us for over a decade, and when he passed, the silence in the house was unbearable. So, about a year later, we adopted a new dog, a big, goofy Great Pyrenees named Duffy. He was an oversized, lumbering, cloud-white idiot with a heart of gold and a head full of air. He loved people, loved other animals, and had absolutely no sense of self-preservation. That summer, the drought had hit hard. The trees in the yard, once thick and full of life, had suffered under months of relentless heat. Many of them had died off, forcing the city to send out crews to cut them down. The towering cottonwoods that had once shaded the backyard were now nothing but stumps, and with them went the nesting grounds for the local crows. We didn't think much of it at the time. The crows had always been around, of course, but without their usual nests in our yard, they became an afterthought. We hardly noticed them during nesting season. Then one day everything changed. It was late afternoon, and I was sitting in the den working on my laptop. The windows were open, and the sound of cicadas buzzed in the background. Duffy had been let outside to roam the backyard, sniff around, and do his business. I wasn't paying much attention until, out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement through the window. Duffy was standing in the middle of the yard, his tail wagging, his big dopey face looking pleased as could be. Around him, a swirling mass of black shapes filled the air. My stomach dropped. Crows, at least 20 of them, maybe more. They were dive-bombing him, cawing in a frenzied chorus of rage. Took me a split second to process why. And then I saw it, the small, struggling body clamped in Duffy's jaws. A baby crow. I don't remember getting up. I don't remember throwing open the screen door. All I remember is running full speed into the yard, screaming at the top of my lungs. "Drop it!" Duffy, bless his idiot heart, looked up at me like I had just ruined his favorite game. His big white tail thumped against the grass. He opened his mouth, and the little crow tumbled out, flapping weakly. But before I could reach him, Duffy lunged forward again, scooping the poor thing back up like it was some kind of living chew toy. The crows overhead lost their minds, their cries blending into a single, furious shriek. I grabbed Duffy's collar and yanked him backward. He let out a confused little whine, but finally, dropped the crow for good. The baby hopped a few times across the grass, stunned but very much alive. Before Duffy could try again, I dragged him, all 90 pounds of him, back into the house, slamming the door shut behind us. The crows did not forget. The war had begun. For the next week, every time I stepped outside with Duffy, they were waiting. It didn't matter if I had him leashed or not. They watched us. They followed us. Every morning, I took him for a walk around the neighborhood, and every morning, a crow perched in the highest branches of the trees we passed, issuing a single, sharp caw. The others picked up the call, one after another, spreading the message down the street. They harassed us constantly. The dive bombing started on the second day. I tried everything, waving my arms, clapping, even bribing them. I set out a bowl of chips on the porch, hoping to buy some goodwill, but it barely seemed to make a dent in their anger. Duffy, of course, remained blissfully unaware of the chaos he had caused. Every time a crow swooped down at us, he just wagged his tail, assuming we were all playing some fantastic new game. One morning, as I stepped outside, I noticed something different. The bowl of chips was empty, as always, but the crows were silent. My yard, once a battleground, was still. For a long moment, I stood there, waiting, listening. Then, in the distance, I heard them, cawing, barking, a ruckus from a yard a few houses down. They had moved on. The war was over. Duffy, finally free, bounded across the yard, blissfully unaware of how close he had come to being the permanent enemy of an entire murder of crows. I watched him go, shaking my head, and just to be safe, I kept that bowl of chips stocked for the rest of the summer. The first time I noticed them, they were just a sound, a background noise, a small irritation, nothing more. It was spring when it started, early enough in the year that the mornings were still cold, but the days had stretched long again. I lived in a rented cabin deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. It was the kind of place where silence should have been absolute, except for the occasional rustling of wind through the evergreens or the distant yelp of a coyote. But that spring, the crows came. At first, it was just a few, their calls blending into the usual morning sounds. Then more arrived. By the time May rolled around, there were dozens nesting in the trees surrounding my cabin. Their calls started before dawn, their sharp, piercing cries cutting through my sleep like a blade. Every morning, just as the night began to pale, I'd wake to the sound of them, relentless, chaotic. It wasn't just noise. It was something deeper, a disruption, a violation of the quiet I had built my life around. I tried earplugs, then a white noise machine. Nothing worked. The sound drilled through everything, settled in my bones, an infection of sound. I was exhausted, frayed at the edges. My hands shook when I poured my coffee in the morning. My head ached constantly. I was unraveling thread by thread, undone by birds. One morning, bleary-eyed and strung out from another night of restless half-sleep, I stumbled outside as the sun was just starting to rise. There, sitting no more than 10 feet from my front steps, was a crow, bigger than I had expected, black eyes locked on mine, watching me. I didn't know why it made my skin crawl, why my breath hitched in my throat. It was just a bird, but something about it, about the way it didn't move, the way it simply watched, felt wrong. I bent down, picked up a small pine cone that had fallen from one of the trees, and tossed it in the bird's direction. Not hard. I wasn't trying to hurt it, just to get it to move. It flapped its wings once, lifted off, and disappeared into the trees. I exhaled, shaking off the unease, and went about my day. But it wasn't over. A few days later, something hit my back as I was loading groceries into my car. It wasn't hard, just enough to make me turn. At my feet lay a crumpled yogurt container, its plastic sides torn and dirty. I frowned. I didn't buy that brand. I looked up, scanning the trees, and there they were. 2 crows perched on a low branch, staring down at me. One of them had something in its beak, another piece of trash, clamped tight. It let go. The trash fluttered down, landing inches from my foot. A message. I didn't know what to do. Yelling seemed ridiculous. Throwing something back felt even more absurd. So I just got into my car and drove away. But it didn't stop. Every time I stepped outside, they were there, watching, leaving bits of trash where I'd be sure to find them. A bottle cap on the steps, a shredded candy wrapper on the hood of my car. Small things, insignificant things, but I knew what they meant. One evening, I decided I wasn't going to let them dictate my life. I went outside onto the patio with a kettlebell, determined to get in a short workout. I was halfway through my routine when the first pine cone hit the ground beside me. Then another. I looked up. The trees were full of them, dozens packed onto every branch, shifting, hopping, wings flicking. And the noise, oh God, the noise, a wall of sound, deafening, overwhelming. They flapped their wings, their movements shaking loose more pine cones. I staggered back, nearly tripping over my own feet. My pulse hammered. It wasn't random. It was coordinated. I turned and ran inside, slamming the door behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps. I felt like a fool. They were birds, just birds. But the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. I stopped going outside unless I had to. I parked closer to the house. I took the back door instead of the front. I kept my head down, avoiding their beady black eyes. But I felt them, Every moment I felt them. Then one morning, everything changed. A baby crow had fallen into my backyard. It was small, barely able to flap its wings, its movements jerky and uncoordinated. Its cries were weak, pitiful. I knew, without a doubt, that the others were watching, waiting. I didn't know why I did it, but I moved carefully around the little bird, making sure not to get too close, not to scare it. I kept my dog on a leash when I let her out. I left out a small bowl of water, and on impulse, I set out a few tortilla chips on the edge of the patio. The baby crow stayed in the yard for 2 days, struggling to gain strength. I never touched it, never interfered, but I knew they saw. The crows in the trees watched, silent now, and then on the third morning, the baby was gone, and so were they. The trees emptied, the constant cawing stopped, the trash disappeared. The silence was strange at first, oppressive, like a pressure I had lived under for months had suddenly been released, and now I had to relearn how to breathe. But the quiet stayed, and the crows never came back. The drive up to the campground had been peaceful. Endless trees lined the winding roads, their branches weaving together like fingers interlocked in prayer. The summer air had the thick scent of pine and damp earth. It was the kind of drive that made you feel like you were truly escaping the world, leaving behind the noise and stress of everyday life. We had chosen this particular state park for its isolation. It wasn't a well-known tourist spot, and the campgrounds were spaced out just enough to feel like you had some semblance of privacy. My partner and I were looking forward to a quiet couple of nights in nature. Just the two of us, a fire, and the sounds of the woods at night. Our assigned campsite was tucked away beneath a canopy of tall, sturdy pines. The gravel pull-in spot was level, and the picnic table looked like it had been recently replaced. It was the perfect setup for a peaceful weekend, or so we thought. As we pulled in, I noticed our nearest neighbors. A thick line of trees separated our site from theirs, but I could see their setup through the gaps. They had an enormous RV, complete with a roaring generator. It was larger than some apartments I had lived in, the kind of thing that made you question why some people even bothered to go camping. The strangest part, though, was the strap they had strung up between two trees. Dangling from it were two blackened, shriveled sausages, each one hooked onto the line like some kind of bait. I frowned, trying to come up with a reasonable explanation. Maybe they were drying out meat, but no one dried out meat like that. It looked like it had been there for a while, forgotten. The skin on the sausages was stretched and wrinkled like it had shriveled in the sun for days. Trying to ignore how unsettling it was, we went about setting up our site. Our neighbors eventually noticed us and walked over to say hello. They were friendly enough, acting as if the whole sausage thing was perfectly normal. When they saw my eyes lingering on the hanging meat, they quickly explained that their buddy had set up a trail camera, hoping to catch raccoons in action. Only the trail camera was pointed directly into our campsite. I felt a prickle of unease but forced myself to brush it off. Maybe they didn't realize where it was aimed. Maybe it was unintentional. Still, it lingered in the back of my mind, especially later that night when I had to step out of the camper to relieve myself. The thought of being caught on some stranger's camera, without my knowledge, left an unsettling pit in my stomach. The next morning, the sausages were still there, swaying slightly in the early morning breeze. A ranger must have come through at some point during the day, though, because by the afternoon they were gone. I didn't see our neighbors remove them, but it was clear they'd been forced to take them down. That should have been the end of it, but the strange feeling never fully left. We ignored our neighbors for the most part after that. They were gone most of the day, leaving their RV and generator silent. It was almost peaceful, the kind of quiet we had hoped for when we chose this spot. We spent the day hiking, cooking over the fire, and enjoying the rare feeling of being completely disconnected from the world. Just as the sun started to dip below the horizon, the peace was broken. Their RV rumbled to life. The generator kicked on, filling the once still night with a dull mechanical hum. The air felt different, heavier. I tried to tell myself it was just the noise, that I was being paranoid, but something about that sight felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that the land itself held something in its roots. that it had soaked up something it shouldn't have. By the time I crawled into my sleeping bag, the feeling had twisted into something worse. The air inside the camper felt stagnant, thick with something I couldn't quite name. My dreams were restless, fractured. I dreamt of dark shapes moving in the trees, of watching eyes and unseen figures shifting just beyond my vision. Then I woke up to the sound of crows. At first, I thought I was dreaming. The noise was unreal. Hundreds, no thousands, of crows, their voices layering over each other in an overwhelming cacophony. It was like a siren, a warning call echoing through the trees. I laid there, frozen, heart pounding. The sound pressed in on me, vibrating in my bones. I had never heard so many birds before in my life. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to look. Peeking through the camper window, my stomach twisted into a knot. Right below where the sausages had been hanging the day before, there was a dead crow. Its wings were sprawled out unnaturally, its body twisted as if it had fallen from the sky mid-flight. The dirt beneath it looked darker, damp, like something had soaked into the earth. Above it, the sky was black with movement. The crows circled in a thick mass, their cries shrill and angry. It was like a funeral, a wake, a mass of grieving creatures mourning one of their own. My chest tightened with an inexplicable sense of dread. I had read once that crows remember faces, that they hold grudges, that they warn each other when something isn't right. I didn't want them to remember mine. I moved fast, waking my partner and hastily packing up the site. I didn't care if it was still early. I didn't care if we had planned to stay another night. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to leave. By the time we pulled out of the campground, the crows were still circling, their cries following us down the road. I glanced back one last time, just in time to see one of them swoop down, landing next to the body of its fallen companion. I don't know what happened at that campsite. I don't know what the deal was with those sausages, or why they had been left there to rot. But I do know one thing: nature remembers. I have told this story to so many people now, and not a single one believes me. I get it. If I heard someone else say this, I'd probably doubt it too. But I swear to you this happened, and I still think about it sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night. It was early October, the year I turned 27. I was working as an independent contractor doing renovations, and the latest job had taken me to a town about 4 hours from where I lived. The client had set me up with a place to stay, a small single-room cabin about 10 miles outside the town limits. It wasn't anything fancy, just a bed, a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom with a shower that barely had any pressure. It was more like a hunting cabin, and from the looks of it, I was probably the first person to stay in it for a while. I didn't mind. I had my tools, a couple of changes of clothes, and a small radio to keep me company. The place was isolated, but it wasn't like I had a lot of options. The job paid well, and I'd only be there for a couple of weeks. The first few nights were uneventful. The trees outside would rustle when the wind picked up, and sometimes I'd hear the distant cry of an animal, but other than that, it was peaceful. I'd get up early, drive to the site, work all day, and come back exhausted. There wasn't much else to do out there except sleep. But on the fourth night, something changed. I woke up around 2:30 in the morning, feeling strange. I don't know how to describe it, but something in my brain told me something was off. I was lying on my back, and the room was completely silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, just a thick, heavy stillness. And then I noticed it. Through the sheer curtains covering the only window, I could see shadows. Shapes, at least 6, maybe 7, standing just outside. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching. My stomach dropped. I didn't have any neighbors. There weren't any houses for miles. The nearest road was half a mile away, and even then, there was no reason for anyone to be out here at this hour. I tried to tell myself I was seeing things, that my eyes were playing tricks on me in the dark. But my gut knew better. I was fully awake now, my heart hammering in my chest. My first instinct was to grab my phone, but as I reached for it, I realized something that made my blood turn ice cold. The people outside, they weren't making any noise. No footsteps, no breathing, nothing. That was wrong. That was so wrong. I had spent enough time in the woods to know how sound worked. Even if they were standing still, I should have heard something, the shifting of weight, the crunch of leaves under their feet. But there was nothing, just absolute silence. I lay there, frozen, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do? Get up? Turn on the light? I didn't want to move. I didn't want them to know I was awake. After what felt like forever, I forced myself to take slow, shallow breaths and reach down for the blanket, pulling it over my head like a child hiding from a monster under the bed. I felt stupid, but at that moment it was the only thing I could do. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to disappear. I don't know how long I stayed like that. A minute? 2? More? But eventually I had to look. I had to know if they were still there. Slowly, I pulled the blanket down just enough to peek over the edge. They were gone. I let out a shaky breath, but the relief didn't last long. The stillness was still there, that unnatural quiet, like the entire world was holding its breath. I waited, straining my ears for any hint of movement. Still nothing. My body screamed at me to move, to get the hell out of there. So I did. I slipped out of bed, grabbed my keys and phone, and got out of that cabin as fast as I could. I got into my truck, locked the doors, and started the engine. The headlights flashed on, illuminating the trees in front of me, but there was nothing there. No footprints, no signs that anyone had been standing outside. But I knew what I saw. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Instead, I drove to a 24-hour gas station in town and sat in the parking lot, trying to convince myself I hadn't imagined the whole thing. The next morning, I went back to the cabin. It looked exactly the same as I had left it. No signs of anything unusual. No footprints. No disturbances. I spent the next few nights sleeping with the lights on, barely getting any rest. Nothing else happened. No more figures, no strange noises. But the feeling of being watched never really went away. When the job was finished, I packed up and left without looking back. I never told my employer what happened. What was I supposed to say? That a bunch of silent people stood outside my cabin in the middle of the night, watching me? They would have laughed me out of town. Even now, years later, I still don't have an explanation. I've thought about every possibility. A prank? Maybe, but why? And how did they disappear so quietly? I don't know. I don't think I ever will. But sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear I can still feel them. Just outside, watching. I had just started living out of my car, kicking things off with a cross-country road trip. The first stretch took me from the Pacific Northwest down the coast toward California. A few days into the trip, I found myself deep in the redwoods, somewhere between small towns and vast, uninhabited stretches of forest. I was inexperienced with car camping, still learning how to pick safe spots, still figuring out the rhythm of this new life. It was getting late, and I needed a place to sleep. I turned off the highway onto an old logging road. These roads are common in forested areas, winding through the trees, sometimes connecting to rural properties, sometimes leading to nowhere at all. The road was narrow, barely enough space for a single car in some sections, climbing steadily uphill. The towering trees loomed overhead, their thick trunks and heavy branches blocking out most of the fading daylight. The deeper I drove, the less of the outside world existed. No streetlights, no houses, no signs of life, just the trees and the road. About a mile in, I found a shoulder wide enough to pull over. It was a small, packed dirt clearing, likely used as a turnaround or a temporary parking spot for hunters or loggers. I killed the engine and took a deep breath. The silence was heavy. No wind, no distant hum of traffic, just the occasional creak of the trees settling. I set up my makeshift camp. Window covers up, seat folded back into a bed, Nintendo Switch on to pass the time. The glow from the screen felt like the only thing tethering me to normalcy. Maybe an hour passed. I was fully relaxed, half lost in the game, when I noticed a light cutting through the darkness. A vehicle was coming up the road. Not just passing by on the highway, this was the same road I was on, and there was nowhere for it to be going except deeper into the forest. My pulse quickened. I told myself it was probably a local, someone heading home or checking their property. No big deal. Then the truck slowed down. It pulled up alongside my car, idling there for what felt like forever but was probably no more than 30 seconds. The headlights beamed through the trees, lighting up the mist that had started to settle in the night air. My heart pounded in my chest. I couldn't see the driver through the glare, but I could feel eyes on me. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the truck continued up the road, disappearing around a bend. I exhaled. Maybe they were checking a map. Maybe they thought my car had broken down and were debating whether to stop. A million rational explanations, but none of them settled the unease in my gut. Then the truck came back. This time, it didn't just slow down. It stopped directly in front of my car, headlights aimed straight at me. The beams lit up my windshield, making it impossible to see beyond them. The truck just sat there, couldn't breathe. My fingers gripped my switch like it was some kind of anchor to reality. But the game may as well have been a million miles away. A full minute passed, maybe more. Then, without warning, the truck reversed, backing up into the darkness and vanishing. That was enough for me. I yanked down my window covers, threw my contacts into my eyes with shaking hands, and fired up the engine. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to leave. My tires crunched over the dirt as I pulled onto the narrow road and started heading back down toward the highway. The adrenaline in my veins was so intense that my body felt numb. Every shadow between the trees felt like something watching me. And then, in my rearview mirror, I saw headlights. My stomach dropped. The same truck. I knew it before my brain could even process it. He was coming fast, closing the distance between us in seconds. The road was too tight to pull over, and I wasn't about to stop anyway. My only option was to drive fast. I pressed the gas, my little hatchback bouncing over the uneven dirt road. But the truck behind me, it had power, it had weight, and it was gaining. The road narrowed to a single lane, and by some cruel twist of fate, another car appeared from the opposite direction. The headlights flashed ahead, forcing me and my pursuer to squeeze onto the shoulder to let it pass. My breath caught as I heard a door slam behind me, footsteps on dirt. My pulse was a hammer in my ears. Someone was walking toward my car. The other vehicle crawled past, its driver probably wondering what the hell was going on. As soon as the gap opened, I floored it, swerving back onto the road and flying down the hill. My tires skidded on loose gravel, my hands clenched around the steering wheel. The truck behind me roared to life, accelerating after me. I hit the highway without stopping, merging into traffic, my speed creeping higher and higher. I told myself the truck would give up once we were back in civilization. But he didn't. He stayed right behind me, tailgating so closely that I couldn't even see his headlights anymore, just the dark, hulking shape of his vehicle in my rear window. Every time I weaved through cars, he did the same. No matter what I did, I couldn't shake him. For nearly an hour, he followed me. I didn't know what his plan was, if he wanted to run me off the road, force me to stop, or just scare the life out of me. Maybe all of the above. I put the nearest police station into my GPS, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. But before I could reach it, something changed. I glanced in my mirror and he was gone. Just like that. No turn-off, no slow retreat. Just gone. I drove for hours before stopping, my body still locked in fight-or-flight mode. When I finally pulled into a hotel parking lot, I sat in the car for a long time, staring at the dark road behind me, half expecting those headlights to appear again. But they never did. To this day, I don't know who he was, what he wanted, or why he picked me. Maybe I had wandered too close to something I wasn't supposed to see. Maybe he was just a bored psychopath looking for a thrill. Or maybe, just maybe, he was waiting for me to stop, and I never did. Late September last year, I took a trip up to a secluded cabin deep in the mountains. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway before the stress of midterms hit me full force. The drive up was long and winding, the roads narrowing as I got further into the forest. By the time I arrived, The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the tall pines that surrounded the cabin. The air was crisp, that perfect autumn chill, and I could smell damp leaves and wood smoke in the distance. The cabin itself was small, rustic, and simple. A single room with a bed pushed up against the wall, a tiny kitchen area with a rusted-out sink, and a wood-burning stove that looked older than me. No running water, no electricity, just the bare essentials. I'd prepared for it, bringing along battery packs, snacks, and plenty of water. My plan was to stay for 2 nights, just long enough to reset my mind before I had to face reality again. That first night was peaceful. I built a small fire outside, ate a sandwich I had packed, and scrolled through my phone until the battery was too low to waste. The night was darker than I was used to. No streetlights, no city glow, just endless blackness beyond the reach of my fire. The quiet was almost unsettling. I'd grown so used to the hum of traffic, people talking, music from passing cars. Out here, the silence pressed against me like a weight. I slept lightly, waking at every snap of a twig or rustling of leaves. At one point, I thought I heard something moving outside, a steady crunch of footsteps pacing just beyond the thin wooden walls. My breath caught, but I forced myself to stay calm. Could have been an animal, maybe even just my imagination playing tricks. Still, I lay there, listening, heart pounding, until exhaustion finally won. The next morning, I woke up early, groggy but determined to make the most of my last full day. I packed up my things and was ready to head out for a short hike before driving back to town. That's when I realized my mistake. I stepped outside, barefoot, the cold ground shocking against my skin. My shoes were in the front seat of my car, a habit I'd picked up from sleeping in my car during road trips. I didn't like the idea of tracking dirt into my sleeping space. I reached for the door handle only to feel it resist. Locked. My stomach dropped. My keys were inside. Panic set in immediately. I had a midterm later that day. I needed to get back to town. My phone was at maybe 15%, not enough to waste on panicking. I took a deep breath, trying to think. There was an old van parked near the edge of the lot, a vanlifer who seemed to have been living there for a while. I figured he might have something I could use, so I walked over, shivering slightly in the morning air. He didn't have a wire hanger or anything else that could help. My mind raced. The windows were cracked open slightly, so I tried to wedge my arm through, twisting and straining, bruising myself in the process. No luck. My arm was too short to reach the lock. I tried using a stick, angling it carefully, but the angle was off. Hours passed. My phone battery drained slowly as I tried different methods, each more frustrating than the last. Finally, with 5% left, I called for roadside assistance. The wait was brutal. I paced, kicked at loose gravel, wrapped my arms around myself for warmth. When the guy finally arrived, I felt like I could cry from relief. He popped the lock in minutes, and I nearly collapsed from the weight of my own stress. By the time I was back on the road, I was running dangerously late. I barely made it back in time for my midterm, still rattled from the morning's disaster. I promised myself I'd never be so careless again. A few weeks passed, and life went on. The stress of exams, the exhaustion of daily life. Then, another blow. I was staying at my partner's place the night before a big convention. We were excited, bags packed, ready to head out early in the morning. But when we stepped outside, my stomach dropped. My car was across the street where I had parked it the night before, but the front left side was ruined. The metal was crumpled inward, headlight shattered, bumper barely hanging on. My mind went blank. I forced myself to move closer. A note was tucked under the wiper. The driver had left their information, at least, but that didn't change the sinking feeling in my gut. I had just started feeling normal again after the cabin incident, and now this. I stood there for what felt like forever, just staring at the wreckage, feeling that crushing weight settle over me again. Took a while to process everything. Insurance, repairs, the constant back and forth. My car would be out of commission for weeks. The financial hit stung, but the worst part was the feeling that everything was spiraling out of my control. It was like the universe was waiting for me to get comfortable before pulling the rug out from under me again. But I got through it. The repairs were made. The days passed. The stress faded little by little. The fear that had clung to me since the cabin started to loosen its grip. Bad things happen, but they pass. And when they do, all you can do is keep moving forward. I pulled into the gas station just after dark. The lights overhead cast a cold, flickering glow over the cracked pavement. My van had been having pressure issues in the driver's rear tire for weeks now, but I kept putting it off. Tonight, I had no choice. It was down to a dangerously low level, and I wasn't about to risk a blowout on these back roads. The air pump was around the side of the building, near the dumpster. I parked, turned off the engine, and climbed out. The air hose was old, stiff from the cold, and hissed as I pulled it over to my tire. As I worked, the station felt too quiet. The occasional car would pass on the main road, but there were no customers, no one coming in or out of the small store. Just me, the buzzing lights, and the steady, rhythmic hum of the air pump. I finished, put the hose back in its place, and just as I was turning to get back in my van, I heard it. "Hey!" It came from the other side of the lot, near the shadows past the pumps. A deep, dragging voice, the kind of sound that makes every hair on your body stand up. Nope, I didn't hesitate. Got in, shut the door, locked it, window up. I sat there waiting, just in case it was someone who actually needed help. I glanced around, but I didn't see anyone. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was someone calling to someone else. But my gut told me otherwise. The way that voice sounded, stretched out, unnatural. It wasn't right. After a few minutes, I left. No one else appeared, and I wasn't about to sit there all night waiting for whatever was lurking in the dark. That wasn't the first weird thing to happen. Not by a long shot. A year ago, I was in my usual spot, sitting in my van, smoking, watching Rick and Morty. It was one of those nights where everything felt just right. Just me, my show, and the kind of high that made everything 10 times funnier. Then I felt it. A shift in the air. A heaviness. The kind of feeling you get when someone is staring at you. I turned my head to the right, and there he was. A man, standing just a few feet away, staring at me like he wanted to rip my throat out. I didn't know him, but he sure as hell knew me. "Can I help you?" Nothing. Just that dead stare. Then finally he spoke. "Yeah, you laugh at me and my girlfriend when we walked by earlier." I blinked. What the hell was he talking about? "You laughed at? I'm watching a show, man. Go away." I rolled my window up, turned back to my show, and tried to ignore the way my heart was beating too fast. I kept my knife over the driver's door. A Viking-style blade. Sharp, sturdy. I wasn't worried. Not really. A few months later, I saw him again. At my church. Great. I didn't say anything. Neither did he. But he was there, sitting a few rows away. I could feel him watching me, but I didn't look at him. Acted like he wasn't there. Then, a few weeks ago, things escalated. I was driving. Cold snap had hit hard, and my van was iced over. I had cleared just enough to see through the windshield. I was making the short drive from work to where I was staying. A simple route. No turns except lefts, so I had my window cracked a little. Unsafe? Maybe, but I liked the cold air. Then I heard it. "You gotta help me, man. They're chasing me." I couldn't see him at first, but I knew that voice. I peeked through the clearing I had made in the frost. No one. "Who's chasing you?" "Demons, man. They're chasing me because I'm the chosen one. Only I can see them. Let me in. Please, man, let me in." It was him. I tried to reason with him, told him there were no demons, but he wasn't hearing it. "Please, man, we went to the same church. If you're a man of God, let me in. Save me. I'm not trying to rob you, man. Save me." Then he started climbing onto my van. That was it. I had enough. As loud as I could, I shouted, "Get the fuck OFF." He didn't, so I cranked the engine, threw it in reverse, and floored it. He fell off. I shifted into drive, turned hard, got around the building, and hit the gas. A few streets away, I pulled over and called 911, told them what happened. A few hours later, a cop called me back. Said they found him, detained him, took him to the hospital for a welfare check. I thought that was the end of it. Then, a few days ago, I saw him again, getting off a bus. I don't know what's going to happen next, but I know one thing. He's not done with me yet. I was 29 when I first heard it. I had been driving for Lyft that day, my car, an old, beaten-up Honda Civic hatchback, serving as both my livelihood and my home. It wasn't much, but it got me from point A to point B, and that was all I needed. After a long shift, I found myself at the edge of a rural park in western Pennsylvania, where a few cars were scattered in the lot, their owners either asleep inside or wandering somewhere unseen. It was late, well past midnight, and the cold was settling in. I was exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that makes your bones ache. My legs were stiff from the hours of driving, my back tight from sitting too long. I parked in a quiet corner, the dark woods pressing up against the edge of the lot. The trees stretched tall and thin, like a wall of shadows. I killed the engine, letting the silence sink in. Routine kicked in. A dab to unwind, a candy bar to kill the hunger, YouTube videos playing softly through my phone speaker. The faint glow of the screen illuminated the inside of the car, the only light in the surrounding darkness. I wasn't thinking about anything except getting some sleep. Then I heard it. It came from the woods, deep enough that I couldn't see anything, but not so far that it felt distant. A noise, a sound I had never heard before, something that sent a ripple of cold down my spine. It was gibbering. That's the only way I can describe it. Not words, not human, but frantic and sharp. A babbling mass of sounds that rose and fell in a way that made no sense. It was fast, too fast, as if 100 voices were speaking over each other, layering and twisting into something unnatural. At first, I thought I was imagining it, just some trick of exhaustion. But then, almost at the same moment, I saw them. People, at least 8 of them, sprinting from the tree line, their silhouettes illuminated by the dim lot lights. They weren't just running, they were fleeing. One by one, they dove into their cars, slamming doors, engines roaring to life. Tires squealed against the pavement as they peeled out of the lot, disappearing into the night without hesitation. The noise got louder. I felt something then. Not fear, not yet. Something deeper, a primal instinct, a clawing in my gut that screamed at me to move. I turned the key. The Civic sputtered for a half second before catching, the dashboard lights flickering to life. My hands were shaking, my fingers clumsy as I threw it into reverse. I didn't look back at the woods. I didn't look at anything except the road ahead. I drove. I didn't stop until I was 20 miles away, parked in a gas station lot under bright fluorescent lights. My heart was still hammering, my breath coming in short, uneven bursts. I sat there, gripping the wheel, trying to make sense of what I had heard. Coyotes. It had to be. A pack going crazy, howling and yipping, their calls distorted by the trees. But no, I knew what coyotes sounded like. I had heard them before. This wasn't that. That night, I barely slept. The next few months passed in a blur. I moved from lot to lot, never staying in one place for too long. But no matter where I went, the memory lingered. I stopped parking near woods. I kept the car doors locked, a knife within reach. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. Then it happened again. This time, I was parked outside the warehouse where I worked part-time, an isolated lot surrounded by open farmland. No trees, no cover, just miles of empty fields stretching into the dark. I had just started to doze off when the sound came. The same gibbering, rising and falling, slipping through the cracks of the night like a whisper meant only for me. I shot up, my breath catching in my throat. My first thought was that someone was outside the car. I reached for the knife, my fingers curling around the handle. But there was no one there, just the darkness, the empty lot, the distant highway, headlights flickering like dying stars. The sound didn't come from a direction. It was everywhere. I sat there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, carefully, I turned the key and started the car. I left the lot without hesitation, driving until the lights of the city swallowed me whole. I don't know what I heard that night. I don't want to know. All I know is that it wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind, or the creak of distant machinery, or some rational thing my mind could pin down. It was something else, and it's still out there. The first trip my wife, Laura, and I took together was a disaster from the start. We had no idea what we were doing. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, just one night at a cheap campsite, followed by a day at the races. We borrowed an old tent from a friend without checking if it was complete, bought a cheap two-person sleeping bag from a big box store, and packed light. Too light, in fact. No backup plans, no extra supplies, just the bare minimum. We left later than planned, sometime around 4 in the afternoon, and the drive took longer than expected. By the time we pulled into the campground, it was already nearing dusk. The place was quiet, just the occasional murmur of voices from other campers and the distant sound of an engine roaring at the nearby track. The smell of firewood and grilled food drifted through the air, making my stomach growl. We found our site, a small clearing between two trees, with enough space to set up our tent and build a small fire. I started unpacking while Laura grabbed the tent. It didn't take long to realize we had a problem. One of the poles was missing. I looked through the bag 3 times, shaking it, turning it inside out, hoping I had somehow overlooked it. But no, one of the main support poles was gone. Maybe we can make it work without it? Laura suggested, holding up the half-collapsed mess of nylon and loose poles. We tried. For a solid 20 minutes, we wrestled with that tent, trying to find some way to prop it up, but it was hopeless. The thing sagged like a deflated balloon. By the time I finally gave up, darkness had fully settled in. "We'll just sleep in the car," I said, trying to make the best of it. Laura went to turn on the headlights to give us some light to work with while we packed up the tent. That's when I heard it. Click. Silence. She tried again. Click. Nothing. The battery was dead. I groaned, rubbing my temples. "Did you start the car when you turned on the headlights?" Her silence told me everything I needed to know. We stood there for a minute, taking it all in. No tent, no car, no way to charge our phones because we hadn't thought to bring a power bank. And then, because things weren't bad enough, the rain started. At first, it was just a light drizzle, the kind that makes you think, maybe it'll pass. Didn't. Within minutes, it turned into a steady downpour, soaking through our clothes and extinguishing the small fire I had barely managed to get going. We just stood there, dripping, staring at the sad pile of damp firewood. I could feel the weight of the trip crushing down on me. Laura looked miserable. Then, out of the darkness, a group of people walked by, heading back from the restroom. They slowed as they passed, taking in our sorry state. One of them, a tall guy with a thick beard, gestured toward our site. "Y'all need some help?" We hesitated, but what other option did we have? The helpers. Their names were Mike, Tom, and Sarah. They had been coming to this campground for years, following the races. Without hesitation, they pulled out an old but functional tent from their gear and set it up on our site. They even jumped our car, got our fire going again, and threw a few extra hot dogs on their grill for us. We sat around their fire, eating, drinking cheap beer, and talking like we had known each other for years. The rain kept falling, but under the canopy of their tent, it wasn't so bad. I remember looking at Laura, her face lit by the fire, and feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Not just for these strangers who had helped us, but for the experience itself. It was a mess, but it was ours. The next day, we followed them to the racetrack, where they set us up in the pit with them. We didn't even have to pay for tickets. They raced that day, and their car took second in their class. That night, we camped again, this time prepared, thanks to them. And just like before, they cooked, they shared their drinks, and we laughed about the disaster that had started it all. Ending. That trip was years ago, but we never stopped going back. Every time we go to the track, we book the same site, hoping to see them again. And almost every time we do. It's like some unspoken tradition now. We pull in, and there they are, setting up camp, waiting for us. We drink, we share stories, We sit around the fire like nothing has changed. We even paid for their sight once when we saw them pull in behind us. Over the years, we got better at camping. These days, we do a lot of backwoods trips, real off-the-grid stuff. But no matter how much we learn, no matter how much we improve, we always come back to that same site for the races. Not for the convenience, not even for the track, but for the memories, for the people. Because sometimes the worst trips make for the best stories. And the best stories are the ones you keep coming back to. The drive up the mountain had been long, the kind of drive where the road seemed to twist endlessly into the woods, each curve cutting deeper into the unknown. I had come here alone, desperate to disconnect from my routine life, sick of the constant buzz of emails, phone calls, and city noise. A weekend of solitude in a rented cabin sounded perfect. Peaceful, isolated, exactly what I needed. The cabin was older than I expected. Its wooden frame sagged slightly, the windows clouded with years of dirt. It had the look of a place that had seen better days but still held onto its bones, refusing to crumble just yet. The trees pressed in around it, thick, tall, and swaying slightly with the wind. I parked my car, grabbed my bag, and made my way up the short porch steps. Inside, the air was stale, but everything seemed in place. A single bed with a stiff mattress, a small kitchen with a propane stove, and a table pushed against the far wall. There was a bathroom, but no plumbing. Just a composting toilet that, if I was lucky, wouldn't reek too badly. There was a wood-burning stove for heat, a stack of logs by the door. No cell service, of course, which I expected but still felt uneasy about. A single landline hung on the wall, dusty and outdated, probably there for emergencies. I spent the afternoon hiking a little, stretching my legs after the long drive. The silence was thick, the kind that settles deep in your bones when you're alone in the wilderness. The occasional rustling in the underbrush sent my nerves flickering. Squirrels, I told myself, or deer. That night, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the cabin's windows. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. At some point, I drifted off. Morning came with a different kind of urgency. I woke with an unmistakable pressure in my gut, the kind that makes you immediately regret whatever you ate the night before. My stomach churned angrily, and I knew I didn't have long. I shot up from the bed, heart pounding, already sweating. The bathroom. I stumbled toward it, pushing open the door. The smell hit me first. Old, musty, like damp wood and something else I didn't want to identify. The toilet itself was just a hole in a wooden box, the kind of setup that made you rethink every meal you'd ever had. My stomach clenched harder, a warning. Nope, not happening. There was an outhouse somewhere nearby. I remembered seeing it mentioned in the cabin's listing. I grabbed a flashlight and pushed out into the morning air. The outhouse was about 50 yards from the cabin, just past a thicket of trees. I moved fast, my stomach twisting violently. But as I reached the small wooden shack, I saw the door was shut, locked. Someone was inside. I groaned, shifting from foot to foot. Who else was even up here? Maybe another camper from a nearby site? I hadn't seen another soul since I arrived, but I hadn't exactly gone looking either. Minutes ticked by. My body was screaming. I knocked lightly on the door. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. Hey, you almost done in there? Silence. A long, painful moment passed. Then, thud, something inside shifted. A slow, deliberate sound, like something heavy dragging along the floor. My gut clenched for an entirely different reason now. I backed up a step. Hello? No response. The wind picked up, rustling the trees, whispering through the cracks in the outhouse's wooden frame. I suddenly felt very exposed. Then the door creaked open, but there was no one inside. The small wooden space was empty. No footprints in the dirt floor. Nothing disturbed. Just a gaping hole in the center, leading down into darkness. A wave of nausea hit me, a mix of fear and my still urgent problem. I had no choice, I had to go. Now, but I wasn't stepping into that outhouse. Not after that. Not after whatever the hell just happened. I turned, scanning the tree line. Secluded spot. That's all I needed. But the forest wasn't empty. A figure stood just beyond the trees, far enough that I couldn't make out the details, but close enough that I knew they were watching. A tall, thin figure, completely still. My stomach dropped. The pain in my gut was nothing compared to the cold that ran through me now. I backed away, not taking my eyes off the shape. It didn't move. It didn't even seem to breathe. I stumbled toward the cabin, reaching for the door, my fingers shaking. I slammed it shut behind me and locked it. My breath came in ragged gasps. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening. Silence. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, right outside. I stepped back. My stomach twisted again, a cruel reminder of why I'd gone outside in the first place. The footsteps stopped. I waited. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. The pain in my stomach dulled, but the fear didn't. Finally, I moved to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek outside. The figure was gone. The outhouse door was closed again. The forest looked empty. I spent the rest of the day inside, listening, watching. That night, I barricaded the door. The wind howled again, but this time I didn't sleep. In the morning, I left. Didn't bother cleaning up. Didn't leave a note. Just threw my bag in the car and drove away. Heart pounding until I was miles down the road. I don't know what I saw. I don't want to know, but I'll never go back. During my summers in college, I had a tradition. Every year, I would make the long drive up to a massive music festival held in a provincial park. It was a pilgrimage of sorts. Thousands of people camping out in the woods, walking the trails to different clearings where bands played all day and deep into the night. It was more than just a festival. It was a community. People were generous beyond belief. You could whisper, "Man, I wish I had a beer," and suddenly, 3 people would offer you one. It was a place where nobody littered, where you could run barefoot without fear of glass or garbage. One summer, though, things took a strange turn. A storm was rolling in, a huge black front creeping across the sky like something out of a disaster movie. The festival continued as usual, people drinking, smoking, dancing, but everyone could feel the energy shift. The air grew thick, electric. The wind picked up, rustling the trees in that eerie way that makes your skin prickle. That afternoon, my friend Jake and I had indulged in some mushroom chocolates. It was supposed to be a light trip, just enough to make the colors pop and the music feel alive. But as the storm gathered strength, reality started bending in ways that made me uneasy. Jake was antsy. "We should hit the porta potties before the storm gets worse," he said, shifting from foot to foot. I was always slow to get moving, and by the time we finally headed that way, the wind was howling. We were only a dozen feet away when a monstrous gust blasted through the camp, sending an entire row of porta potties toppling like dominoes. I froze. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. If I had been even 30 seconds quicker, we would have been inside one of those. We would have been covered in piss, shit, and that awful blue chemical. Jake let out a nervous laugh. "Jesus, man, your slowness just saved our lives." The storm ripped through the camp, flattening tents, sending tarps and folding chairs flying. People screamed, ran for shelter, clung to whatever they could. Our own tent was shaking so violently that I thought it might lift off the ground. When it was over, the festival felt different. A lot of people had packed up and left, leaving empty campsites behind. The festival wasn't over yet, but it was quieter, less alive. Jake and I huddled in our tent for a while, waiting for everything to settle. Then, as if on cue, a voice rang out through the night from a nearby campsite. "People of the festival, come smoke the biggest joint you have ever seen." It wasn't an exaggeration. We walked over and saw a group of people huddled around a joint the size of my forearm. There must have been 50 of us there, passing it around. The guys who rolled it had been planning to sell their stash, but with so many festival goers gone, they just decided to go all in. That night felt like something out of a dream. The air was cool after the storm. The music still played faintly in the distance, and everyone just sat there in the firelight, laughing, talking, existing in that perfect moment. It was a night I would never forget. Not because of anything supernatural or unexplainable, but because it was real. A brush with disaster, followed by an experience so pure, so human, that it felt like something out of another world. And for a while, as the joint made its way around the circle, as the laughter rose into the night, the storm felt like a distant memory. We had survived it, and in that moment, that was enough. I was 12 when my parents first took me camping. Summers were spent running barefoot through wet grass, dodging fireflies, and listening to the night sounds through thin tent walls. Those trips defined my childhood, and as I got older, I carried the tradition forward, spending 4-day stretches at festivals, huddled in tents with friends, mud caked to our boots, music thundering through our bones. When I had my daughter, Claire, I wanted her to have that same connection with the outdoors. But she resisted, hard. She liked structure, preferred her world clean and predictable. The idea of sleeping on the ground, even with her best friend sharing a tent, was horrifying to her. I convinced her it was only 3 days. We'd have bug spray, good food, and fun. The first day was always rough. After arriving, I checked in with the site owners, a couple who also ran a working farm. Their dog, a scruffy mutt with warm brown eyes, had the same name as my great-grandmother, Mabel. Felt like a good omen. Morning came with the expected groans from Claire and her friend. But then Mabel trotted into camp, wagging her tail, and everything shifted. The girls laughed, chasing her through the field. The resistance faded. They explored the woods at the edge of the campsite, played with the dog, and even joined in on some of my planned activities. The trip became a cherished tradition. We returned each year. We even made custom tie-dyed t-shirts to commemorate the experience. Last summer, another family set up camp nearby with a Brittany Terrier. The kids were delighted. Claire no longer dreaded the trip. She looked forward to it. But this year was different. I booked the same site, packed the car, and set out early. The drive felt longer than usual, the roads emptier. The site had always been a lively place, with families unpacking, kids running through the field, the scent of wood smoke drifting through the air. But when we arrived, something was off. The farmhouse looked abandoned. I parked near the check-in office, expecting to see the owners, but the door was shut, the windows dark. Mabel was nowhere in sight. I knocked, waited, nothing. The site itself was mostly empty. Only one other tent sat at the far end of the field, but I didn't see any people. Claire and her friend, Anna, got out of the car, stretching after the long ride. "Where is everyone?" Claire asked. I didn't have an answer. I thought about leaving, but we'd driven hours to get here, and maybe the owners were just out, running an errand. The site was still in decent shape, fresh firewood stacked by the pits, picnic tables clean. I set up camp while the girls wandered off to explore. The woods stood just as they always had, thick and inviting, a mix of birch and oak. But the silence was unnerving. No distant voices, no laughter, no farm sounds. By dusk, the other tent remained unoccupied. The fire crackled as I cooked, the girls talking softly, the earlier excitement dulled by the atmosphere. That night, I woke up needing the bathroom. The field was covered in mist, the air thick and heavy. I stepped out of the tent, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Movement, by the trees. I froze. A figure stood at the edge of the woods, too far to make out details, but I could feel its stare. A sick feeling settled in my stomach. "Hello," I called out. No response. Then the figure turned and slipped into the trees. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I checked the farmhouse again. Still empty, but something had changed, fresh footprints in the dirt, leading from the back door to the woods. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a hiker, maybe the other campers, but their tent was still zipped shut, untouched. The girls spent the day playing by the stream, tossing rocks, laughing. I tried to relax, but the unease never left. That night, I woke again. This time, it wasn't to go to the bathroom. Something scratched against the tent fabric. I held my breath, listening. The The fire had died down to embers, casting weak, flickering shadows. I reached for my flashlight, turned it on. Nothing. Then movement. Not outside. Inside the tent. A shuffle. A breath that wasn't mine. I turned the flashlight toward Claire and Anna. They were asleep, but something was wrong. The tent zipper was open, just an inch. I forced myself to move, slowly zipping it up, checking the tent's interior. Nothing. No one. Had I left it open? I didn't think so. The next day, Claire found something near the woods. A piece of rope, knotted tightly, frayed at the edges, as if it had been cut. Probably from a tent or something, I said, forcing a smile. But I took it from her and threw it in the fire. By the final night, I was exhausted. The site still felt abandoned, except for us and the silent tent at the far end of the field. At some point, I drifted into a restless sleep. Then footsteps. Close. Too close. I sat up, listening. Something pressed against the tent wall. A handprint. I grabbed the flashlight, heart hammering, and unzipped the tent in one swift motion, shining the light outside. Nothing. Just the empty field. The other tent. The trees. And then I saw it. The other tent. It was open. Empty. No bags. No sleeping bags. No people. As if no one had ever been there at all. We left before dawn. I never went back. And I never looked up what happened to the farm. Some things are better left unknown. I had been planning this trip for years. Solo camping, deep in the wilderness, away from everything and everyone. It had always been on my list, but life kept getting in the way. Work, relationships, responsibilities, there was always something. But last year, I finally decided it was time. I packed up my gear, mapped out my route, and set off for Montana, where I would spend weeks camping in some of the most remote parts of Glacier National Park. My first few nights were peaceful. The quiet was something I had been craving. I fell asleep to the sounds of rustling leaves, the occasional call of an owl, and the gentle hum of the wind. Every morning, I would wake up with the sun, make coffee over my small campfire, and just sit, letting the world around me breathe. It was everything I had hoped for. It was about a week in when I decided to take a detour. I had been following a rough plan, but I wanted to explore more off the beaten path. I found a smaller, lesser-known trail that led up a ridge, promising a beautiful view of the valley below. It was a steep climb, and the sun was already getting low by the time I reached the top. That's when I saw her. She was an older woman, maybe in her late 60s, sitting on a rock just off the trail. Her hair was silver, tied back in a loose braid, and she wore a heavy jacket despite the warmth of the evening. She looked like she had been there for a while, just staring out at the landscape. I hesitated for a moment, not wanting to intrude, but she must have heard me because she turned her head slightly in acknowledgement. I gave a small nod, more of a reflex than anything, and was about to keep moving when she spoke. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Her voice was soft, but there was something behind it, something heavy. I nodded again, stepping a little closer. "Yeah, it's incredible." She turned back to the view. I don't know why, but I stayed. I wasn't looking for company, but something about the moment felt different, like I was meant to be there. After a few minutes of silence, she spoke again. "My husband and I were supposed to come here together." I glanced at her, waiting. "We talked about it for years," she continued. "Glacier was at the top of our list. We had it all planned. Then life happened. We pushed it back, told ourselves we had time." She paused, inhaling deeply. "Then he died. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. I just let her talk. It happened fast. One day we were making plans, the next he was gone. Just like that." She pulled her jacket tighter around herself. The air was cooling now, the sun beginning to sink below the horizon. "I almost didn't come," she admitted, "but I knew if I didn't, I'd regret it." I shifted slightly, feeling the weight of her words. I understood in a way. We always tell ourselves we have more time, until we don't. We sat there in silence for a long time. The sky darkened, the first stars appearing above us. Eventually, she stood. "I should get going," she said. "It was nice to have some company for a bit." I nodded, watching as she picked up her pack. She hesitated, then offered me a small smile. "Take your trips while you can," she said. "You never know when it'll be too late." And then she was gone, disappearing down the trail, leaving me alone on the ridge. I sat there for a long time after she left, staring out at the valley, thinking about everything she had said. Eventually, I got up, made my way back to my camp, and lay awake for hours, listening to the wind, feeling the weight of her words settle deep in my chest. That night changed something in me. I didn't know it at the time, but it did. I had come on this trip looking for solitude, but what I found was something else entirely. A reminder, a warning. We always think we have more time, until we don't. I was about 10 years old the summer my family went camping deep in the national forest. It was the kind of place where you had to know it existed to find it. No signs, no pavement, just a dirt road winding through the trees until it opened up to a small clearing by the river. We had been there a few times before, always choosing the same spot right along the bank where the sound of the water was constant, lulling us to sleep at night. That weekend, we were the only ones at the campground, at least for the first few hours. I remember helping my dad set up the tent, the two of us fumbling with the poles while my mom arranged the cooler and my little sister collected twigs for a fire. It was shaping up to be another perfect camping trip, until the old lady arrived. She came in an ancient pop-up camper, its canvas sides yellowed from years of use. The thing rattled as she pulled it in, and when she stepped out, she shaded her eyes against the sun and looked right at us. "Y'all took my favorite spot," she called, her voice full of warmth, not anger. My dad walked over to greet her, and after a bit of back and forth, she explained that she and her late husband had been coming here for over 40 years. This was her first time coming alone. She asked if we could help her back her trailer into the site next to ours, since she wasn't used to doing it without her husband. My dad helped, and soon enough, she was settled in. A few hours later, as the sun dipped behind the trees, she wandered over to our campsite. In one hand, she held a massive pot. In the other, a wooden spoon. "I made a big pot of beans and hot dogs," she said. "Too much for just me. Y'all are welcome to some if you want." We had already eaten, but my parents, being the kind-hearted people they were, didn't want to turn her down. So we joined her at her little folding table, eating spoonfuls of smoky beans and sliced hot dogs. She was a talker, full of stories about this place, about how the river once flooded so bad it swallowed half the campsites, about the time a bear walked right up to her husband while he was cooking breakfast. My parents listened with polite nods, but I could tell something was off. She barely touched her own food. As a kid, I wasn't thinking about it too much. I just sat there, picking at my portion and watching the way she smiled a little too wide, the way her hands shook just slightly as she set down her spoon. After we finished eating, she thanked us and we went back to our site. But even after I climbed into my sleeping bag that night, I kept thinking about her, about how her stories had been interesting but somehow rehearsed, like she had told them too many times to too many people. The next morning, she was still there. Her camper sat just as it had the night before, and I saw her sitting outside in a folding chair, staring out at the river. I remember watching her from the safety of our site, my stomach twisting with something I didn't quite understand. Something about her felt too alone. She came by again that afternoon, standing at the edge of our site, smiling in that same too-wide way. She asked us about our plans for the day, and my dad told her we were thinking about hiking up to an overlook a few miles away. "Be careful up there," she said. "It's easy to lose track of time in the woods." We set out not long after, following the narrow trail through the trees. The climb was steeper than I expected, and my little sister whined most of the way up, but the view at the top was worth it. We stayed for a while, taking in the sight of the endless green forest rolling out beneath us. Then we started back down, and that's when things started feeling wrong. The woods seemed different, quieter, as if the birds and insects had stopped making noise. My dad led the way, but after what felt like way too long, we hadn't made it back to camp. The trail didn't look right anymore. We kept walking, and then, just as my mom was about to suggest turning around, we saw something ahead through the trees. Not our campsite, hers. Her camper parked in the same exact spot, the folding chair still sitting outside, empty. But there was no sign of her. We had walked in a straight line. There was no way we should have ended up here. I don't remember what my parents said to each other in that moment, but I remember the way my mom grabbed my sister's hand a little too hard, the way my dad's face went tight. We hurried back to our own site, throwing things into bags, breaking down the tent as fast as possible. I looked back just once before we left. The old lady was standing there, right outside her camper, watching us, smiling. We didn't talk much on the drive home. I never saw her again, but every once in a while, I think about that trip, about how, for years afterward, I'd wake up in the middle of the night to the smell of smoky beans and hot dogs. And sometimes, just for a second, I'd swear I could hear her voice, soft and sweet, whispering through the trees. Be careful up there. It's easy to lose track of time in the woods. I don't know exactly when things started feeling wrong, but by the time I noticed, it was already too late. I had rented a cabin deep in the woods, a place far from everything. I wanted silence, isolation, a break from the world. Work had burned me out, and I needed time away from people. A week in the middle of nowhere sounded perfect. No emails, no traffic, no noise. Just me, the trees, and a small wooden cabin surrounded by nature. The first day was peaceful. I arrived in the afternoon, parked my truck near the front steps, and unlocked the door with the key I'd picked up from the rental office. The cabin was small but cozy. A living room with an old couch and a fireplace, a tiny kitchen, a bathroom, and a single bedroom. Everything smelled of aged wood and dust, like no one had stayed there for a long time. Outside, the trees stretched endlessly in all directions. I saw no trails, no signs of other people, just thick woods pressing in like walls. The quiet was almost overwhelming at first. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, just the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. That first night, I slept deeply, feeling safe in the solitude. But when I woke up, something was different. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. The air felt heavier, like the atmosphere had changed. I brushed it off as nothing. Maybe I wasn't used to this kind of quiet. I spent the next day exploring the woods, hiking a bit but always keeping the cabin in sight. The trees were thick, their branches tangled together like fingers, blocking out most of the sky. The further I walked, the darker it got under the canopy. I turned back before I could lose sight of the cabin. That evening, I made a fire in the fireplace and ate a simple meal. The food tasted bland, though I wasn't sure why. As the sun went down, the shadows inside the cabin stretched longer, and the walls seemed to close in. I shook the feeling off and went to bed early. I woke up in the middle of the night. I wasn't sure why at first, but then I heard it. Something outside. A soft crunching sound, like footsteps on dried leaves. I held my breath, listening. Could have been an animal, maybe a deer, but it didn't move like an animal. The steps were slow, deliberate, pausing, then continuing. I sat up, heart pounding. My truck was parked just outside, and the doors were locked, but the thought of someone out there, just beyond the thin walls, made my skin crawl. I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand, flicked it on, and shined it through the bedroom window. Nothing, just darkness and trees. The sounds had stopped. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, filling in the silence with imagined noises. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been standing out there, just listening, watching. The next day, I found something that made my stomach drop. In the dirt just outside the cabin, near the treeline, I saw footprints. Not boots, not sneakers, bare feet. They led from the trees toward the cabin, stopping just a few feet from the porch steps. Then they turned around and disappeared back into the woods. I tried to stay rational. Maybe some hiker had wandered close, though I hadn't seen any trails or paths. Maybe someone was living out here, But that didn't make sense either. Why walk barefoot in the woods? And why stop so close to my cabin before turning back? I spent the day on edge, checking the windows, looking over my shoulder. The woods that had felt peaceful before now felt different, like they were hiding something, like they weren't empty at all. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every sound made me sit up, heart racing. The wind through the trees, the creak of the cabin settling. But nothing else happened. On the fourth day, I made the decision to leave early. The unease had settled deep in my bones, and I couldn't shake it. I packed my bag, loaded up my truck, and went inside for one last look around. Then I saw it. Near the fireplace, where I had stacked wood on my first night, there was something that hadn't been there before. A single footprint, a bare footprint, pressed into the thin layer of dust on the wooden floor. My stomach turned. Someone had been inside. I didn't stop to think. I rushed out, jumped into my truck, and started the engine. The tires spun in the dirt as I sped down the narrow road, away from that place. I didn't look back. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted. I never told anyone about it. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, I wake up thinking about that footprint in the dust, about the quiet, deliberate steps outside my window. And I wonder, if I hadn't left that day, what would have happened next? I never wanted to come out here. The cabin was supposed to be a break, a chance to get away from work, from the noise of the city, from everything. But from the moment I stepped onto the old wooden porch, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't anything obvious, just a feeling, something in the air that made my skin crawl. The place had been in my family for years, but no one ever really used it. My uncle had built it decades ago, deep in the woods, far from any roads or towns. After he died, it just sat here empty. I never heard of anyone coming up here after that. It looked normal enough. A one-story log cabin, the kind you see in postcards, with a slanted tin roof and a small deck overlooking the trees. The wood was dark and weathered, but it was still solid. There was a single window at the front, covered in dust. The door creaked when I pushed it open, the inside smelling of old wood, dust, and something else, something faint, almost metallic. The main room had a couch, an old wooden table, a fireplace, and a small kitchen in the back. There was a hallway leading to a bedroom and a tiny bathroom. Everything looked untouched. It was as if my uncle had just stepped out and never returned. His old boots were still by the door. A coffee cup sat on the counter, a thin layer of dust covering it. A newspaper lay on the table, the date so old the pages had yellowed. I set my bags down and checked my phone. No signal. Not surprising. The nearest town was about 20 miles away, and I'd already lost reception halfway down the dirt road. I told myself I'd be fine. A few days of peace and quiet. No emails, no texts, just me and the woods. That night, I couldn't sleep. The bed was stiff and the cabin made noises. Wood settling, wind pushing against the roof, small creaks and groans that I told myself were normal. But there was something else, something softer, a sound just outside, like footsteps crunching in the leaves. I sat up, listening. The wind howled, the branches scraping against the walls. But beneath all of that, I swore I heard breathing, slow, steady, just beyond the window. I didn't move. My eyes stayed on the ceiling, heart pounding in my ears. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, coyote, something harmless. But my gut told me otherwise. I must have drifted off at some point, because when I woke up, the sun was already pushing through the trees. I felt exhausted, like I hadn't really slept at all. I made coffee, sat by the window, and stared outside. The woods were still. Nothing moved, not even the wind. I tried to shake off the feeling from the night before, telling myself I was just being paranoid. That afternoon, I decided to check around the cabin, just to be sure. I walked the perimeter, looking for tracks or signs of animals. The ground was covered in old leaves and damp soil, but then I saw them. Footprints, bare, human, leading from the tree straight to my window. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I traced the path. They stopped right beneath my bedroom window, then turned back toward the woods. They were fresh, the edges of the prints still sharp. Someone had been standing there last night, watching, listening. I rushed inside, locking the doors, checking every window. Nothing had been broken, nothing was missing, but that didn't make me feel any better. Someone had been out there. Someone knew I was here. That night, I stayed up, sitting on the couch with a flashlight and a kitchen knife. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Every sound made me jump. Hours passed. Midnight came and went, and then I heard it. A soft tap, not at the door, not at the window, from underneath the cabin. I held my breath. The floorboards creaked slightly, like something shifting beneath them. There was another tap, then another, a slow, deliberate pattern, like someone drumming their fingers against the wood. I wanted to tell myself it was an animal, but I knew better. I grabbed my flashlight and moved to the corner of the room, where a small vent led beneath the cabin. I crouched down, heart hammering, and shined the light through the slats. For a second, I saw nothing, just darkness. And then, eyes staring back at me. I stumbled backward, hitting the table, knocking over the coffee cup. The eyes didn't move. They just stayed there, locked onto mine, unblinking. Then, slowly, they vanished into the darkness. I didn't sleep. I didn't move from my spot on the couch. My knife gripped so tight my fingers ached. By the time the sun rose, I had already made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed my bags in under 5 minutes, grabbed my keys, and yanked the front door open. The air was cold, the woods silent. My truck sat a few yards away, untouched. But as I took my first step outside, I saw them. More footprints, dozens of them, leading from the woods, surrounding the cabin. I ran. I didn't care about the bags, about anything. I just needed to leave. I reached my truck, threw the door open, and turned the key. The engine sputtered, stalled. No, not now. I tried again. It wouldn't start. My pulse pounded. I glanced up at the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw them. Figures, standing at the edge of the trees, watching, motionless. I didn't think. I jumped out, running down the dirt road. My lungs burned. My legs ached. I didn't stop. I ran until I found the main road, until I saw another car, until I knew I was safe. I never went back. I never told anyone what happened. The cabin still stands, rotting slowly in the woods, untouched. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I know they're still there, waiting. I don't know why I ever thought coming up here alone was a good idea. Maybe I wanted a break from the city. Maybe I just needed space to think. Either way, I regret it now. The drive up took longer than expected. The road twisted through the woods like a snake, the kind of road where you don't pass another car for miles. The cabin itself was smaller than I imagined. Just one floor, a simple A-frame with a porch out front. It looked old but sturdy, sitting in the middle of a clearing surrounded by thick pines. The nearest town was almost an hour away. By the time I arrived, the sun was already setting. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp leaves and pine needles. Inside, the cabin was basic. A single bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a living area with a wood stove. No TV, no internet, just silence. I liked that at first. That changed around midnight. I was in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard something outside. At first, I thought it was an animal. A branch cracking, leaves shifting, normal forest sounds. But then it happened again. Closer this time. A deliberate sound, like footsteps. I held my breath, listening. I told myself it was just a deer, maybe a raccoon. I forced myself to stay in bed, but my heart pounded hard against my ribs. Then the noise stopped. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling, waiting. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it was my imagination and fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I found tracks in the dirt outside. Not animal tracks, boot prints. They circled the cabin once, stopping beneath my bedroom window. I stood there for a long time just staring at them. The ground was still damp from the rain a few days before, making the prints stand out clearly. Whoever it was had been standing there, right outside my window while I was in bed. I should have left then, packed up and driven back to town. But I didn't. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a hunter, maybe some lost hiker. The woods weren't exactly busy, but they weren't completely empty either. I didn't want to overreact, so I stayed. That night, I locked the doors and shut the curtains. I kept a fire going in the wood stove, the glow flickering against the walls. The silence felt heavier now, pressing down on me. I tried to read, tried to distract myself, but every noise outside made me jump. Then, around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. I sat up in bed, barely breathing. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, but I couldn't see anything beyond the curtains. The footsteps stopped right outside the bedroom window. Then, nothing. I stayed frozen, gripping the sheets. I thought about grabbing the knife from the kitchen, but I was too scared to move. I waited, listening. After what felt like forever, the footsteps started again. This time, they moved toward the porch. The wooden steps creaked. Whoever it was, they were right outside the front door. I forced myself to move. Slowly, quietly, I slid out of bed and crept to the kitchen. My hands trembled as I grabbed the knife. The silence stretched on. Then the doorknob rattled. A slow, testing turn. I gripped the knife tighter, my pulse pounding in my ears. The door was locked. I had checked it 3 times before bed. Whoever was out there must have known I was inside. They had to. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. The porch creaked once more, then silence. I stood there for hours, knife in hand, waiting, listening. Eventually, the sky began to lighten. Morning. I didn't sleep that night. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside, knife still clenched in my fist. The boot prints were there again. This time, they led from my window to the front porch, stopping at the door. Then they turned back toward the woods. I packed my things, fast. I didn't even eat breakfast. I threw everything in the car and started the engine, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. As I pulled away, I glanced at the cabin one last time. That's when I saw it. Just beyond the tree line, half hidden in the shadows, someone was standing there, watching me. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I just drove. I don't know who they were or what they wanted. I don't care. I'm never going back. I was never the type of person to believe in bad luck, but looking back now, I should have taken the warning signs more seriously. It all started when I decided to spend a week alone in a cabin deep in the woods of Montana. It wasn't some last-minute, reckless decision. I had planned it for months. My job had been stressing me out, and my personal life wasn't much better. I needed solitude, a break from the constant noise of the city, so I rented a remote cabin online. The pictures looked perfect, small, sturdy, nestled between thick pine trees, with a narrow dirt road leading up to it. No neighbors, no distractions, just me and the wilderness. I arrived late in the afternoon. The drive up was longer than expected, the road winding and full of potholes. My SUV struggled over the rough terrain, and more than once, I thought I'd get stuck. But I made it. The cabin was exactly as it had been in the pictures. Small, wooden, with a single front porch and an old-fashioned chimney poking out of the roof. There was a shed to the side, covered in rusted tools and stacks of firewood. The forest pressed close around the property, and as soon as I stepped out of the car, I was swallowed by silence. No cars, no buzzing electricity, just the wind moving through the trees. Inside, the cabin was basic but comfortable. A small kitchen with an old gas stove, a creaky wooden table, a living space with a couch and a fireplace. The bedroom was in the back, barely big enough for the bed and a narrow dresser. The bathroom had an old toilet and a shower stall that looked like it hadn't been used in years. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, barely any cell service. That was the point. The first night was peaceful. I lit a fire, made dinner, and sat outside for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest. I heard owls, distant rustling in the trees. Maybe deer, maybe something else. It was calming. The air was crisp and cold, and I felt a rare sense of relief, like I had made the right decision coming here. The second night was when things started to feel off. It began with small noises. At first, I assumed it was just the usual sounds of the woods, branches shifting, animals moving through the brush. But then I heard something that made me pause. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving just beyond the tree line. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it in the direction of the noise, but all I saw was darkness. The trees were too thick, the shadows too deep. I told myself it was just paranoia, the effect of being alone in a place like this. Still, I locked the cabin door before going to bed that night. On the third day, I noticed things had moved. Nothing dramatic, just small changes. My flashlight, which I had left on the table, was now on the floor. The can of coffee I had placed in the cupboard was on the counter. I tried to convince myself I was just forgetting things, but I knew better. I had been careful, methodical. I didn't like the feeling creeping into my gut. That night, the noises came again, but this time they were closer. Footsteps, slow, careful, circling the cabin. I sat in the dark, listening. My hands gripped the blanket tightly, my breathing shallow. The steps would pause, then start again like someone was waiting, listening. I held my breath and waited too. Then they stopped. I stayed awake for hours, heart pounding, staring at the ceiling. When morning came, I checked outside. Nothing. No tracks, no signs that anyone had been there. But I knew what I had heard. On the fourth day, I hiked a little. I wanted to clear my head, convince myself I was just getting stir-crazy. I followed a narrow trail that led deeper into the forest, the trees towering over me, the ground soft with old leaves. An hour in, I found something that made my stomach drop. A small clearing with an old rotting tent. It had been there for years, the fabric shredded, the poles bent. Scattered around it were torn clothes, a rusted camping stove, a backpack with a broken zipper, and a knife. It was half buried in the dirt, its blade covered in rust. I didn't touch it. Something about the whole scene felt wrong, like I had stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see. I turned and walked back to the cabin, faster than before, constantly looking over my shoulder. That night, I barely slept. I kept my flashlight next to me, my knife under the pillow. Every noise made me jump. Around midnight, I heard something different. Not footsteps this time, breathing. Just outside the window. Deep, slow breathing. I stayed completely still. My heart felt like it was going to explode. The breathing went on for what felt like forever, then stopped. I don't know how long I stayed frozen like that. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off because when I opened my eyes again, the first light of dawn was creeping through the curtains. That morning, I made a decision. I was leaving. I packed up my things, loaded them into the SUV, and started the engine. As I turned onto the dirt road, I felt relief wash over me. But then, in my rearview mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure stood at the tree line, tall, motionless, watching. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline of a man. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove until I hit the main road, until I was miles away from that cabin, from whatever had been out there. I never reported it. What would I even say? That I heard footsteps? That I saw someone standing in the woods? Maybe it was just some drifter, someone living out there, scavenging. Or maybe it was something worse. I still think about that cabin sometimes. About the noises, the moved objects, the breathing outside my window. I tell myself it was nothing, that I was just imagining things. But I don't really believe that. And I know deep down that whoever or whatever was out there was real. I never liked the woods. Something about them always made me feel uneasy. The way the trees closed in, how sound seemed swallowed up by the thick air. But when my brother convinced me to take a solo weekend at a remote cabin he found online, I figured I'd give it a shot. He said it would be good for me. Some peace and quiet away from the city, a break from work. He even covered the rental, so I had no excuse to say no. The drive out was long and winding. Paved roads turned to gravel, then dirt. My phone lost signal an hour before I even reached the place. It was deeper in the forest than I expected, hidden away like some forgotten relic. When I pulled up, the cabin was exactly what the pictures showed. Small, wooden, with a porch that creaked under my steps. The key was waiting under the mat like the owner had promised. Inside, it was simple. A single room with a kitchen tucked into the corner, a wood stove against the far wall, and a bed that looked like it had seen better days. The only other door led to a tiny bathroom with a rust-stained sink and a shower barely big enough to turn around in. The windows were old, their frames swollen from years of rain, and the floorboards groaned with every step. It was quiet, too quiet. I told myself that's what I came for, but the silence felt heavy, like the air itself was watching. I tried to ignore it. I unpacked my bag, set up my laptop on the rickety table, and decided to make the best of it. No distractions, no noise, just me and the woods. That first night, I didn't sleep well. The bed was uncomfortable, but it was more than that. I kept waking up, convinced I had heard something outside. A branch snapping, the soft crunch of leaves. Maybe an animal. But every time I sat up and listened, there was nothing. Just the cabin settling, the wind against the roof. The second day, I went for a walk. I figured getting familiar with the area might ease my nerves. The trees stretched endlessly in every direction, their branches tangled together like skeletal fingers. I marked my path with sticks and rocks, not wanting to get lost, but even then, I nearly did. The deeper I went, the more everything started looking the same. That's when I found the first sign that something was off. A pile of rocks stacked neatly in the middle of the trail. Not natural, not something that just happened. Someone had placed them there. A marker? A warning? I didn't know, but it made my skin crawl. I turned back, moving faster than I meant to. Every sound behind me suddenly too loud, too close. That night, I locked the door. Not just the knob, but the deadbolt, too. I even pushed a chair in front of it just in case. Maybe I was being paranoid, but something about that pile of rocks unsettled me in a way I couldn't shake. I woke up to the sound of footsteps, not inside the cabin, but right outside. Slow, deliberate, someone moving carefully, just beyond the thin walls. My heart pounded. I stayed still, barely breathing, straining to hear. The steps stopped, then started again, circling the cabin. I reached for my phone, but I already knew. No signal, no way to call for help. The only weapon I had was a dull kitchen knife, and that wouldn't do much if someone decided to break in. I sat there, gripping the handle, waiting, hoping it was just my imagination. Morning came and I forced myself outside. I needed to see if there were tracks, some proof that I hadn't lost my mind. The dirt around the cabin was disturbed, but not by boots, by bare feet. Human definitely, but wrong. The toes were long, almost claw-like, the arches too high. I should have left then. I should have packed my things and driven away. But something in me wanted answers. I followed the footprints, weaving through the trees, deeper into the forest. And then I saw it. A cabin. Not mine, but nearly identical, hidden among the trees. Old, abandoned. The windows were broken, the door slightly ajar. I don't know what made me go inside, but I did. The air was thick with the scent of rot, and the floor was littered with things people had left behind. Clothes, old cans, a rusted knife, and on the walls, scratches, deep gouges like something had been trying to claw its way out. I turned to leave, but something caught my eye. A photo pinned to the wall with a hunting knife. My stomach dropped. It was my cabin, the same one I had been sleeping in, and there was someone standing on the porch, looking directly at the camera. The face was blurred, but the shape of the body, the way it stood, it was wrong. Twisted, almost human, but not quite. I ran. I didn't stop. I crashed through the woods, tripping, falling, skinning my hands, my knees. When I reached the cabin, I didn't even go inside. I grabbed my keys, threw my bag into the car, and sped down the dirt road, my tires kicking up dust. I didn't stop driving until I was back in town. I booked a motel for the night, sat on the bed, shaking, trying to understand what had happened. The cabin's owner never answered my calls. When I checked the listing again, it was gone, like it had never existed. I don't know what I saw. I don't know who or what was out there in those woods. But I do know one thing. I'm never going back. I should have never gone up there alone. Looking back, every choice I made that weekend was a mistake. But at the time, I thought I was just getting away from everything. A break from the city, from the noise, from the constant rush of people moving around like they had somewhere important to be. I wanted silence, peace. What I got instead was something else entirely. The cabin belonged to my uncle. He used it for hunting season, but he hadn't been up there in years. He told me it was still in decent shape, but I should bring extra supplies just in case. I loaded up my truck with enough food and water for a few days, a small generator, my rifle, and a few other essentials. The drive up took longer than I expected. The roads were mostly dirt, rough and uneven. I had to slow down more than once to keep from damaging my truck suspension. By the time I pulled up to the clearing where the cabin stood, the sun was already dipping behind the trees. It looked just as I remembered, small, weathered, surrounded by dense forest. A single window on the front, shutters hanging slightly askew, and a porch that creaked under my boots as I stepped onto it. The door was stiff, and I had to put my shoulder into it to get it open. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and the faint scent of old wood. A few dead leaves had blown in through the cracks around the door, scattering across the floor. I set my bags down and did a quick check of the place. There wasn't much to it. One main room with a fireplace, a small kitchenette, a cot in the corner, and a door leading to the tiny bathroom. The water didn't run anymore, but there was a well out back. My uncle had left a few old lanterns, a stack of firewood, and some canned food in the cabinets. It would do. After unpacking, I stepped outside to get some air. The trees were tall and thick, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze. The forest was quiet, not completely silent, but still enough that I could hear every rustle of leaves, every distant crack of a branch. I didn't think much of it then. I should have. That first night, I slept lightly. The cot was stiff, and the forest made strange noises. I kept my rifle within arm's reach just in case. At some point, I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to a sound outside. A dull, rhythmic thudding. I sat up, heart pounding, listened. The sound was slow, steady. Not footsteps, not an animal. It was coming from the woods. I grabbed my flashlight, crept to the window, and shined it out into the trees. Nothing, just darkness and the endless stretch of trunks disappearing into the night. The sound stopped. I stood there for a long time, waiting, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just a tree branch falling or something shifting in the night. I went back to bed but didn't sleep much. The next morning, I went out to check around the cabin. The ground was undisturbed. No tracks, nothing out of place. Maybe I had imagined it. I spent most of the day chopping wood, fixing one of the broken shutters, and just keeping myself busy. By evening, I had almost forgotten about the noise. Almost. That night, it happened again. The same slow, steady thudding. I sat up, listening, heart hammering in my chest. This time, it was closer. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just listened. Then silence. I held onto my rifle and stayed awake for hours, staring at the door, waiting. Nothing. I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the window. I forced myself up, body aching from lack of sleep, and stepped outside. There were tracks this time. Not animal tracks, not boot prints, bare feet, large. The prints circled the cabin once, then disappeared back into the trees. I stood there for a long time, staring at them, trying to understand what I was looking at. The ground was still damp from the morning dew, which meant the prints were fresh. I had been sleeping while something, had been right outside my door. I went back inside, locked the door, and loaded my rifle. I thought about leaving right then and there, but I told myself it was probably just some local messing around. Maybe a hunter, maybe a drifter. I didn't know, but I wasn't going to let them scare me off. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in a chair facing the door, rifle in my lap, waiting. The hours crawled by. The forest was too quiet. The air felt thick, heavy. Around midnight, I heard it again. Thud, thud, thud. Slow, deliberate. I raised my rifle, pointing it at the door. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. The sound stopped. I stayed like that for what felt like forever, but nothing happened. No movement, no more sounds. Morning came. I stepped outside, rifle in hand. The prints were back, fresh, circling the cabin once again. This time, they didn't lead back into the trees. This time, they led to the well. I walked over, every muscle in my body tense. Peered inside. Nothing, just dark water, still and undisturbed. I left that afternoon, packed up my things, loaded my truck, and didn't look back. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was nothing, but I never went back. Neither did my uncle. To this day, I don't know what was out there. I don't want to know. I had no reason to be out there. If I'm being honest, I had every reason not to be. It wasn't a vacation. It wasn't some life-affirming getaway. It was me running. I needed space, needed to be away from people, from the noise, from everything that felt like it was choking me back in the city. I thought a cabin deep in the woods would be the answer. A place where no one could find me, where I could sit in the quiet and breathe again. I found it online. Some old rental tucked away in a place that barely had a name. The pictures made it look cozy, small but comfortable. A simple wooden structure with a front porch and a fire pit out back. The owner's description made it clear that it was isolated. No Wi-Fi, no service, no neighbors for miles. That was exactly what I was looking for. The drive up was long, the kind of long that makes you second guess if you made a wrong turn somewhere. The road twisted through miles of thick trees, the kind that seemed to swallow the sunlight the deeper you went. My GPS cut out an hour before I arrived, but the instructions were clear enough to follow. By the time I saw the cabin, the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, the sky turning that deep shade of orange that meant night wasn't far off. It looked just like the pictures. Weathered wood, a small porch, a single window on the front that was dark and empty. I parked beside it, stepping out onto the uneven dirt. The air smelled damp, like moss and pine, and the only sounds were the soft rustling of leaves and the distant call of some unseen bird. No traffic, no voices, no city hum, just silence. Inside, the cabin was as simple as I expected. A small kitchen area, a fireplace, a couch that looked like it had seen better days. There was a single bedroom in the back, just big enough for a bed and a dresser, and a tiny bathroom with rust stains in the sink. It smelled stale, like the windows hadn't been opened in a long time. But I didn't care. It was quiet. That's all I wanted. That first night was peaceful. I made a small fire in the fireplace, heated up a can of soup on the gas stove, and sat on the couch, staring at nothing. No notifications, no voices, just me and the crackling of the fire. I slept better than I had in months. The next morning, I woke up early. The light streamed in through the thin curtains, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Felt good. I made some coffee, stepped out onto the porch, and just listened. Nothing but trees stretching out in every direction. It should have felt freeing, but there was something else too. Something I couldn't place. A feeling just beneath the surface. I brushed it off, just my mind adjusting to the quiet. I spent the day exploring the area. There wasn't much to see. Just trees, more trees, and a narrow stream about a 10-minute walk from the cabin. I followed the water for a while, kicking stones, letting my thoughts drift. Felt good to be out there, away from everything. It wasn't until I started heading back that I noticed something strange. Footprints. Not mine. Not fresh either, but deep enough in the soft earth to still be visible. They led in the same direction I was walking, toward the cabin. I stopped, looked around. No one, just trees and the faint sound of the water behind me. I told myself they were old. Maybe the owner had been out here at some point, or maybe another renter. I kept walking. That night, I locked the door. I hadn't thought to do it the night before. It hadn't felt necessary. But something about those footprints sat in the back of my mind. The woods were empty, I told myself. I was alone. The next few days were quiet, uneventful. I settled into a routine, waking up early, drinking coffee on the porch, walking through the woods, cooking whatever simple meal I had brought. I tried reading, but my mind wandered. I tried writing, but the words felt forced. Then, on the fourth night, I woke up to a sound. It wasn't loud, just a soft, shuffling noise. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again, closer, a slow, deliberate step on the porch. I lay there, completely still. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I strained to hear, but the sound was gone, just silence. I told myself it was an animal, a raccoon maybe, something sniffing around, but I didn't get up to check. I just lay there, listening until I finally fell back asleep. The next morning, I found something strange on the porch. The wooden planks were dusty, covered in a thin layer of dirt from the trees, but near the door, the dust had been disturbed. A footprint, a bare footprint. I stared at it for a long time. My own feet had never touched that spot. I always wore shoes outside. It was too clear, too defined to be old. I felt something then, a pressure in my chest, a deep, twisting unease. I wasn't alone. I spent the rest of the day in a fog. My mind tried to come up with explanations, but none of them sat right. By the time the sun began to set, I had made up my mind. I was leaving in the morning. That night, I barely slept. Every creak, every rustle outside sent my heart racing. I kept the fire going, the flickering light casting shadows across the walls. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. The sound on the porch. Slow, steady. I gripped the blanket, barely breathing. The floorboards creaked. Then, a soft rattle at the door handle. Not forceful, just testing. I didn't move, couldn't. The door was locked. It had to be enough. Minutes passed. Then, the sound of retreating footsteps. I stayed awake until dawn. As soon as there was enough light, I packed my things. I didn't care if I left anything behind. I grabbed my keys, stepped onto the porch, and froze. The footprints. They led away from the door, down the steps, and into the trees. Bare footprints, deep, fresh, leading into the woods. I didn't stop to think. I got in my car, started the engine, and drove. The trees blurred past, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main road, where I finally got a signal. I never reported it, never told anyone what happened. What would I even say? But sometimes, late at night, I still think about that cabin, about the footprints, about the slow, careful sound of someone testing the door. And I wonder, how long had they been watching me before I ever heard a sound? I drove up the winding road, my truck's tires crunching against gravel as I approached the cabin. The sun was already dipping behind the thick trees, casting long shadows that stretched across the dirt path. The air smelled like pine, damp earth, and something faintly metallic. I rolled my window down to get a better breath of the fresh mountain air, but instead, a chill crawled up my spine. It wasn't from the cold. The cabin belonged to a friend of mine, Greg. He had been letting me use it for the weekend. Work had been stressing me out, and I needed to get away. I wasn't one of those guys who believed in the whole being one with nature thing, but I figured a couple of days in the middle of nowhere could do me some good. No emails, no phone calls, no deadlines, just me, the trees, and a case of beer. I parked the truck beside the cabin, cutting the engine. The silence hit me immediately. Not just a normal kind of quiet, but the kind that makes you notice your own breathing. No wind, no birds, just stillness. It was unsettling, but I shrugged it off. City life had me too used to background noise. The cabin was a simple structure, old but sturdy. Logs stacked on logs, a slanted roof, and a small porch with 2 rocking chairs that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. The windows were dark. I grabbed my duffel bag from the passenger seat and headed up the wooden steps. The porch creaked under my weight, the sound breaking the silence for the first time since I arrived. Greg had left the key under a loose floorboard near the door. I found it easily and let myself in. The inside smelled like dust and old wood. A fireplace sat against the far wall, a pile of firewood stacked neatly beside it. A small kitchen took up one corner, with an old gas stove and a fridge that hummed softly. The main room had a worn-out couch, a wooden table, and a single armchair. A hallway led to a single bedroom and a small bathroom. I set my bag down and flicked the light switch. The bulbs flickered before settling into a dim glow. The place was cold. I made a mental note to get a fire going before it got too late. I grabbed a beer from the fridge, popped the cap, and took a long sip. As I stood there, I realized just how alone I was. There wasn't another soul for miles. No neighbors, no roads nearby, just me and the woods. The feeling was both freeing and unnerving. I spent the first hour unpacking and checking the place out. Everything seemed fine, no signs of rodents, no leaks, no issues. I grabbed some wood and got a fire started in the fireplace, watching as the flames took hold and spread warmth through the room. The glow made the cabin feel a little less empty. By the time night settled in, the temperature had dropped sharply. I locked the front door, making sure the bolt was secure. Then I checked the back door, the windows. Everything was locked up tight. I wasn't worried about anything, but being in an unfamiliar place alone made me cautious. I settled onto the couch with my beer, staring at the fire. The crackling was soothing. My mind started to drift when a sound outside made me sit up. It was faint, barely noticeable over the fire, but it was there, a soft crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. Probably an animal. Maybe a deer. I told myself that, but something about the sound bothered me. It wasn't random like the way animals move, it was deliberate, slow, careful. I stood up and moved to the window, peeking out through the glass. The porch was empty. The truck was still there. The trees stood still, their dark forms blending together in the moonlight. I didn't see anything, but the feeling didn't go away. I shook it off, convincing myself I was just spooking myself out. I turned away from the window and headed to the bathroom. As I washed my face, I kept glancing at the mirror, expecting to see something behind me, but there was nothing. I turned off the light and walked to the bedroom, shutting the door behind me. The bed was old but comfortable enough. I crawled under the thick blankets, my breath fogging slightly in the cold air. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I heard it again. Crunch. Closer this time. I sat up, my pulse pounding in my ears. That was not a deer. That was not an animal. It was footsteps. Human footsteps. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, reaching for my duffel bag. I kept a hunting knife in there, just in case. My fingers closed around the handle just as something brushed against the window outside. A shadow passed by the thin curtains. I froze. My grip tightened on the knife. The sound of slow, deliberate breathing filled the silence. Not mine. Someone was outside my bedroom window. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I waited. Minutes passed. The breathing stopped. The shadow was gone. I forced myself to move, creeping toward the window, gripping the knife so hard my hand ached. I lifted the curtain just an inch, peering out. Nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in bed, knife in hand, staring at the door, listening. When the sun rose, I stepped outside. My stomach dropped. Footprints. Large, deep footprints circled the cabin. They led from the woods to my bedroom window to the front door, and then back into the trees. Someone had been watching me all night. I didn't stay to find out who. I grabbed my bag, threw it in the truck, and left without looking back. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know one thing. I wasn't alone. I drove for hours, leaving the last town behind as I followed the winding road up into the mountains. The pavement turned to gravel, then to dirt. My tires crunched over the dried leaves and twigs as I navigated through dense woods. The cabin was deep in the forest, far from everything. That's what I wanted: solitude. A weekend alone to clear my head, away from noise, from people, from life. The cabin itself was old, weathered by years of wind and rain. The wood was dark, almost black in places, and the roof sagged slightly, but it looked sturdy. There was no electricity, no running water, just a small wood-burning stove, an oil lamp, and a few pieces of worn furniture. A single room with a cot in the corner, a table and a chair. A few cabinets lined one wall, stocked with basic supplies: canned food, matches, a hatchet. There was an old hunting rifle mounted above the door. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The first night was uneventful. I made a small fire in the stove, cooked a can of beans, and read by the dim light of the lamp. The forest outside was silent, except for the occasional rustling of leaves and distant hoots of an owl. I fell asleep easily, the kind of sleep that comes from being away from everything. I woke up in the middle of the night, though, not because of a noise, but because of an absence of it. The woods had gone completely silent. No wind, no insects, nothing. I sat up, listening. The stillness pressed against my ears, unnatural in its depth. I reached for the oil lamp, but my fingers were clumsy, and I knocked it over. The sound of it hitting the floor seemed deafening in the silence. I held my breath, waiting. Nothing, just the dark and the quiet. Morning came and I shook off the unease. I convinced myself it had just been the strangeness of being alone in an unfamiliar place. I spent the day exploring the area, walking through the trees, following a small creek that ran not far from the cabin. I found old tracks, deer maybe, but nothing fresh. The forest felt empty, hollow. That night, the silence returned. Not immediately. At first, it was normal crickets, the occasional snap of a branch. But slowly, those sounds faded. By midnight, it was the same as before, dead quiet. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to steady my breathing. Then I heard it. Not a noise exactly, but a presence, a pressure in the air. Something was out there, standing in the trees. I don't know how I knew, but I did. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. My skin prickled. My heart pounded against my ribs. I wanted to get up, to look outside, but I couldn't make myself move. Then a sound, soft, deliberate. Footsteps crushing leaves just beyond the cabin walls. Slow, careful steps circling. I gripped the edge of the cot, every muscle locked. The steps stopped. I waited, ears straining. Nothing. Then a long, slow exhale right outside the window. I didn't sleep that night. At dawn, I forced myself to go outside. The dirt around the cabin was undisturbed. No prints, no sign that anything had been there. But I knew. I felt it. Something had stood there, watching me. I spent the day gathering firewood, trying to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I checked my car, half considering leaving, but the thought of driving down those miles of empty road, knowing something had followed me, was worse. That night, I sat up with the rifle, the oil lamp burning low. The silence returned, heavier than before. Hours passed, nothing happened. Then, just as I started to think I had imagined everything, the door handle moved. A slow turn. The latch clicked. I raised the rifle, my hands shaking. The door didn't open. It stayed closed, but something was on the other side, testing it. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't move. Then, after what felt like forever, the handle slowly turned back. The latch clicked again. The pressure in the air lessened. Whatever was out there had left. I didn't sleep. I didn't move until the sun came up. When I finally found the courage to open the door, the world outside looked the same as before. The trees, the dirt, the empty woods. But I knew better. I had never been alone. I packed my things, threw everything into the car. I didn't care about leaving the cabin as it was. I just needed to go. As I backed up, my tires spun for a moment in the loose dirt, and in that instant, I saw them. Footprints, dozens of them circling the cabin, overlapping. They hadn't been there before. I had checked. I didn't stop driving until I was hours away, until the mountains were far behind me. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I don't know what I would have even said, but I know one thing for certain. I was never alone in that cabin, and whatever was out there, it wasn't human. I don't know why I thought going up there alone was a good idea. Maybe I wanted the quiet. Maybe I just wanted to get away from everything. Work had been draining. My apartment felt suffocating. And I figured a few days in the woods would help clear my head. No phone, no emails, just me, the trees, and the old family cabin I hadn't visited in years. The place had been in my family for decades, but no one really used it anymore. My dad used to take me up there when I was a kid, but after he passed, it just sat empty. It wasn't much, just a simple one-room cabin with a small loft, a wood-burning stove, and a creaky front porch. It had no electricity, just a few old lanterns and a propane stove. Water came from a well out back. The nearest town was about 20 miles away, and there was no real road, just a dirt path barely wide enough for my truck. I got there in the late afternoon. The sky was already turning gray, and the wind had that cold bite that let you know winter wasn't far off. I unlocked the rusted padlock on the door, pushed it open, and was immediately hit with the smell of dust, wood, and thyme. Everything was just as I remembered. Old furniture covered in sheets, a stack of firewood against the wall, a few pots and pans hanging above the tiny sink. The place was cold, but I'd fix that soon enough. The first thing I did was get a fire going in the stove. It took some effort, but soon, the little cabin started to warm up. I unrolled my sleeping bag on the cot in the corner and set my lantern on the nightstand. My plan was simple: read, maybe write a little, go on a few hikes, and just exist without the constant pull of the outside world. The first night was uneventful. I woke up once to the sound of wind howling through the trees, but that was normal. I fell back asleep and didn't wake up again until the sun was pushing through the cracks in the wooden shutters. The second day was peaceful. I chopped some firewood, made a simple breakfast, and spent the afternoon hiking up one of the old trails my dad used to take me on. Felt good being out there alone. The quiet was thick, heavy, but not in a bad way, just different. That changed on the second night. I was sitting by the fire, writing in my notebook, when I heard something outside. A soft, rhythmic crunching sound. Footsteps on the frost-covered ground. I froze, my pen hovering above the paper. Could have been a deer, maybe a raccoon, but something about the sound felt off. Too slow, too deliberate. I stood up, moved to the window, and peered out into the darkness. The moon was half covered by clouds, but I could still make out the trees, the clearing, the old well. Nothing looked out of place. I waited, my ears straining against the silence. The footsteps had stopped. I told myself it was nothing and went to bed. But sleep didn't come easy. I kept waking up, sure I'd heard something just outside the cabin. A soft shuffle, the creak of wood, like someone shifting their weight on the porch. But every time I got up to check, there was nothing there, just the wind and the trees. The next morning I found tracks. They weren't animal tracks. They were footprints, bare footprints, human. They started near the edge of the clearing, weaved through the trees, and stopped just short of the porch. There were no tracks leading away. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. The ground was hard with frost, and the prints were clear, each toe defined in the dirt. Whoever had made them had been barefoot, in the cold, in the middle of nowhere. I told myself it was an old set of prints, maybe left by some hiker who'd come through weeks ago before the frost set in. But that didn't make sense. No one hiked up here, and the tracks were fresh. I spent the rest of the day feeling on edge. Every sound seemed too loud. Every gust of wind felt like something moving just out of sight. I thought about leaving, but I pushed the idea away. I wasn't going to scare myself out of my own cabin. That night, I locked the door and kept the fire going. I lay in my sleeping bag, my knife within arm's reach, listening. The wind had died down, and the silence felt heavier than before. At some point, I must have dozed off, because the next thing I remember was waking up to the sound of the porch creaking. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just listened. Another creak. Slow, deliberate. Something was out there, standing on the porch. I turned my head toward the window, but all I could see was darkness. Then, softly, something tapped against the glass. A single, deliberate tap. I stayed completely still. My heart was hammering in my chest. Another tap, then another. like someone was testing the glass. I gripped my knife and forced myself to sit up. The room was dim, the fire casting long shadows against the walls. I turned my gaze to the door. The lock was still in place. The door hadn't moved. The tapping stopped. For a long time, nothing happened. Then I heard it, a slow, dragging sound, moving away from the cabin. Footsteps, crunching in the frost. I waited until the sound faded completely before I moved. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I opened the door. The air was freezing. My breath came out in thick clouds. I stepped onto the porch and looked down. More footprints, bare, leading from the window across the clearing into the trees. I didn't think. I grabbed my bag, stuffed everything inside, and got the hell out of there. The whole drive back, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something, someone, but the road stayed empty. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted, and I don't think I ever will. But I do know this. I'm never going back to that cabin again. The drive to the cabin took longer than I expected. The roads were narrow, twisting through dense forest, and the last 30 minutes were nothing but gravel and potholes. My tires crunched over the loose stones, the sound filling the otherwise silent evening. The sun had already dipped behind the trees, leaving the sky a dark, bruised shade of blue. I hadn't seen another car in over an hour. I rented the cabin for a week. Needed a break from the city, from people, from everything. It wasn't much. A simple wooden structure deep in the woods. No neighbors for miles. No cell service. Just me and the quiet. The photos online made it look cozy. The reality was different. The cabin sat in a small clearing, the trees pressing in on all sides. The wood was old, dark, the kind that absorbed the last light of day rather than reflecting it. A single porch light flickered weakly above the door. There was a firewood pile stacked against the side of the cabin, but it looked damp, useless. I turned off the engine and stepped out. The air smelled like wet earth and pine. My boots sank slightly into the soft ground as I walked up to the front door. The key was in a small lockbox, just as the rental confirmation had said. I punched in the code, took the key, and pushed the door open. The inside was fine. Wooden floors, wooden walls, a small kitchenette, a single bed pushed up against the far wall, a fireplace that hadn't been used in a long time. Dust hung in the air, disturbed by my entrance. There was a table with 2 chairs, a small couch with an old blanket draped over it, and a single window that looked out into the trees. The place smelled stale, like it hadn't been aired out in months. I set my bag down by the bed and walked to the kitchen. The cabinets held a few basic supplies, some canned goods, a half-empty box of pasta, a bottle of oil. The fridge was empty except for a lone bottle of water and a packet of butter. I had brought my own food, so I wasn't worried. After unpacking, I decided to check out the area. Stepping outside, I noticed how eerily quiet it was. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the distant sound of the wind moving through the trees. I walked around the perimeter of the cabin. The forest was dense, the trees packed so tightly together that it was impossible to see more than a few feet in. It gave me an uneasy feeling. I found a small, overgrown path leading away from the cabin. It looked like no one had used it in a long time, but curiosity got the better of me. I walked for about 10 minutes before I saw something strange. A set of footprints in the dirt. They weren't mine. They were old, but definitely human. I crouched down, studying them. Barefoot. The prints were deep, like whoever made them was running. My skin prickled. There was no reason for anyone to be out here, especially barefoot. I followed them a little further, but they disappeared into the underbrush. I turned back. The uneasy feeling stayed with me. That night, I built a fire in the fireplace, made myself some dinner, and sat at the table, listening to the crackling flames. The silence outside felt heavier as the night went on. At one point, I thought I heard something, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on the gravel outside. I froze, listening. Nothing. I checked the window. The porch light barely illuminated the area in front of the cabin, and beyond that, it was just darkness. I I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer. I went to bed early, but I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, heart pounding for no reason. At one point, I thought I heard something moving outside again. A slow, deliberate sound, like someone shifting their weight on the porch. I held my breath, listening. Silence. The next morning, I found something strange near my car. Footprints. Fresh ones. They circled the vehicle, leading to the driver's side door before stopping. I stood there, staring at them. My own prints were there too, but these were different. Slightly larger than mine. I looked around. The forest was still and empty. I felt watched. The day dragged on. I kept busy, hiking a little, reading, trying to enjoy the solitude. But that feeling never left me. That night, I locked the door, checked the windows twice, and kept the fire going longer than I needed to. I listened for sounds outside. I told myself I was being paranoid. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up again. This time, I knew I wasn't imagining it. There was a noise, a faint scraping sound, coming from the door. I didn't move. It stopped. I lay there, heart pounding, staring at the ceiling. A few minutes passed. Then, a soft creak. The sound of weight shifting on the porch. Someone was out there. I stayed perfectly still. My breathing was shallow, my body frozen. The doorknob rattled lightly, then silence. I don't know how long I lay there before I finally got up, moving as quietly as I could. I grabbed my flashlight and a kitchen knife and crept to the window. I angled the light towards the porch. Empty. But then I saw it. The footprints. Fresh, in the dirt, leading from the woods to my door. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in the chair by the fire, knife in my lap, jumping at every sound. The hours crawled by. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I made my decision. I packed my things in under 5 minutes. When I stepped outside, the footprints were gone, like they had never been there. But I knew what I had seen. I drove away without looking back. I never figured out who or what was out there that night. But I know this. I wasn't alone in those woods, and I never will be again. I drove up to the cabin just before sundown. The trees were thick on either side of the road, dark and towering. The gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled up in front of the small wooden structure. It was old, but sturdy, sitting there alone in the middle of nowhere. No neighbors, no streetlights, no cell service. That was the point. I needed space to clear my head, to be away from everything and everyone. I had rented the place for a week. Just me, my thoughts, and the quiet. Stepping out of the car, the air was cooler than I expected. The kind of cold that settles in your bones, even in the early fall. I grabbed my duffel bag from the passenger seat and made my way up the porch steps. The wood creaked beneath my boots. The key was under the mat, just like the owner had said. I unlocked the door and pushed it open. The smell of old wood and dust hit me immediately. The cabin was small. A single room with a kitchenette in the corner, a fireplace against the far wall, and a narrow hallway leading to the bathroom and bedroom. Simple, but enough. I flicked the light switch. Nothing happened. The owner warned me about this. Said the power could be unreliable out here. There were lanterns and a generator if I needed them. I sighed and set my bag down on the floor, my breath already visible in the air. I walked over to the fireplace and stacked a few logs from the pile next to it. A box of matches sat on the mantel. It took a few tries, but soon enough, flames licked at the wood, casting flickering light across the room. The warmth helped, but the shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and deepen. I tried to ignore them. After a quick dinner of canned soup, I unpacked a little. My duffel bag was mostly filled with clothes, a flashlight, a hunting knife I kept just in case, and a book I probably wouldn't read. I laid my things out on the bed in the next room and looked out the single window. Just trees. Nothing but endless trees stretching into the dark. I don't know what made me stop, but I kept staring at the trees. Something about the way they moved in the wind felt off. It wasn't normal swaying, it was slow, almost deliberate. But maybe I was imagining things. I turned away and shut the curtains. The first night was uneventful. The sounds of the woods outside were louder than I expected. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, the occasional distant cry of an animal. I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. My fingers curled tightly around the handle of my knife under the covers. The next morning, I went outside to get some air. The forest was dense, the kind that made you feel watched even when you knew you were alone. I decided to walk a bit, stretch my legs, get familiar with the area. The owner had mentioned an old hunting trail a few hundred yards behind the cabin. The woods were thick with undergrowth. The ground was damp. My boots left deep imprints in the mud. As I moved forward, I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling that strange sense of being watched. But there was nothing, just trees. Then I found it, a small clearing with something strange in the middle. Bones, not scattered, not chewed up like an animal had gotten to them, but arranged in a neat little pile. They were clean, too clean. Some of them were small, like they came from birds or rabbits. Others were longer, thicker, maybe deer. I didn't like it. I turned back toward the cabin, walking faster this time. My gut told me something was wrong, and I trusted it. I was trained to. By the time I got back, the wind had picked up. The air was colder now, biting against my skin. I locked the door behind me and stood there for a moment, listening. Nothing, just my own breathing. The second night was worse. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the porch. Not an animal. Too heavy. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there, gripping my knife. The steps stopped near the door. Silence. Then the doorknob rattled. Not hard, just enough to test it. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The fire had died down, leaving the cabin in almost complete darkness. I sat there for what felt like hours, waiting for something to happen. Eventually, the footsteps moved away, slowly. In the morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside. Bare feet, human. The prints led into the woods, disappearing between the trees. I thought about leaving right then, packing up my things and driving back to town. But I had no real proof of anything, just footprints and fear. And maybe, I told myself, it was some drifter passing through. Maybe they thought the cabin was abandoned. That night, I locked the door, checked the windows twice, and kept my knife within reach. I barely slept. Every noise outside sent my heart racing. The wind howled, the trees creaked, and somewhere, in the middle of the night, I thought I heard breathing just outside the window. The next morning, I found something new. Hanging from the porch, just above the door, was a small bundle of sticks and bones tied together with string. It hadn't been there the day before. I took it down and threw it into the trees. Then I packed my bag. I didn't care how ridiculous I looked for leaving early. Something wasn't right. My gut screamed at me to go. As I loaded my bag into the car, I glanced back at the trees. For a second, I swore I saw movement. A shape standing between the trunks, too far to make out clearly. Watching. I didn't wait. I got in my car and drove, gravel spitting up behind me. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back in town. I never went back. A week later, I got a call from the cabin's owner. He sounded confused. He asked if I had left something behind. When I told him no, he hesitated. Then he said, "Well, someone's been staying there since you left." I hung up and never looked back. It started as a simple trip, a quiet getaway to clear my mind. A week alone in a rented cabin deep in the woods, away from the noise, the stress, the people. I had been needing this break for months. Work had been suffocating. My personal life had been a mess, and I thought some solitude would help me put things back in order. The cabin was old, built decades ago, maybe longer. It stood at the end of a narrow dirt road, surrounded by thick forest in every direction. The listing said it was secluded and perfect for those seeking solitude. That was exactly what I wanted. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was the silence. No cars, no voices, just the occasional rustle of the trees when the wind picked up. It was late afternoon when I stepped out of my car. The cabin stood there, small but sturdy, with a slanted roof and a wraparound porch. It had a single chimney, though I doubted I'd use the fireplace. The place had been cleaned before my arrival, but there was still a musty scent in the air, the kind that clings to old wood and fabric. Inside, the layout was simple: one main room with a kitchen area, a small dining table, and a couch near the fireplace. A short hallway led to a bathroom and a single bedroom. The furniture was outdated but functional. A few family photos hung on the walls, the kind with faces faded from years of exposure to sunlight. I unpacked quickly, putting away my groceries, setting up my laptop even though I had no intention of using it much. I had no cell signal out here, and the Wi-Fi was spotty at best. That was fine. I wasn't here to be online. That first night, I sat on the porch with a beer, listening to the wind in the trees. I watched the sun set, the sky turning deep orange before fading to black. It was peaceful, exactly what I had hoped for. But sometime after midnight, I woke up. The cabin was silent, but something felt off. I lay still, listening. At first, I thought it was just the unfamiliarity of the place messing with me. New environments always had a way of making sleep feel lighter. Then I heard it, a sound, faint, almost imperceptible, like something moving inside the cabin. I held my breath, listening harder. It came again, a soft creak, like wood shifting under weight. Not the kind of sound the wind makes, not the house settling. Something else, something inside. I turned on the lamp beside my bed and sat up. My heart was pounding. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the sound was nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I got up, moving carefully, listening for any other noises. I checked the main room, the kitchen, even the bathroom. Nothing. Everything was exactly as I left it. The doors were locked, the windows shut. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I went back to bed but left the lamp on. I must have drifted off eventually because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the window. I told myself I had been paranoid. First night alone in an unfamiliar place. Of course I'd feel uneasy. That's normal. The second night, I locked up just the same, made sure everything was secure before going to bed. I fell asleep faster this time, comforted by the knowledge that I had overreacted the night before. But then I woke up again. This time I heard it clearly, the sound of something shifting inside the cabin. Not just a creak, something moving. I sat up, my pulse hammering. I turned on the lamp and listened. Silence. I got out of bed, moving slower this time. I checked the main room again. The chairs at the dining table looked different. They weren't how I had left them. One was slightly pulled out, just enough to notice. I felt a cold wave run through me. I knew I hadn't touched that chair. I had eaten at the table earlier, sure, but I had pushed all the chairs in before going to bed. I was certain something was in this cabin, or had been. I checked the doors again, locked. The windows shut. No signs of forced entry. No footprints, no disturbances other than the chair. I told myself I must have misremembered. Maybe I had left it like that. Maybe I was just tired. But deep down, I knew better. I barely slept the rest of that night, jumping at every small sound. When morning came, I felt drained, but I forced myself to go about my day as usual. By the third night, I was on edge before even going to bed. I double-checked everything, made sure every door and window was secure. I even put a chair in front of the bedroom door. It was a ridiculous precaution, but it made me feel better. That night, I didn't just wake up. I was jolted awake. Something had moved in the cabin. I heard it, a sharp creak closer this time. I turned on the lamp, heart pounding. I looked toward the door. The chair I had placed in front of it had moved. Not knocked over, not pushed to the side, just moved. A few inches away from where I had placed it. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My entire body was frozen with fear. Something was in here with me. I stayed awake until dawn, barely blinking, my eyes locked on the door. When morning finally came, I packed my things without a second thought. I left the cabin that day, drove away without looking back. I didn't even bother to call the rental company, didn't care about getting my money back. I just wanted to be as far away from that place as possible. I don't know what was in there. I don't want to know. But something was, and it was watching me. It started as a simple trip, a quiet getaway to clear my mind. A week alone in a rented cabin deep in the woods, away from the noise, the stress, the people. I had been needing this break for months. Work had been suffocating. My personal life had been a mess, and I thought some solitude would help me put things back in order. The cabin was old, built decades ago, maybe longer. It stood at the end of a narrow dirt road, surrounded by thick forest in every direction. The listing said it was secluded and perfect for those seeking solitude. That was exactly what I wanted. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was the silence. No cars, no voices, just the occasional rustle of the trees when the wind picked up. It was late afternoon when I stepped out of my car. The cabin stood there, small but sturdy, with a slanted roof and a wraparound porch. It had a single chimney, though I doubted I'd use the fireplace. The place had been cleaned before my arrival, but there was still a musty scent in the air, the kind that clings to old wood and fabric. Inside, the layout was simple: one main room with a kitchen area, a small dining table, and a couch near the fireplace. A short hallway led to a bathroom and a single bedroom. The furniture was outdated but functional. A few family photos hung on the walls, the kind with faces faded from years of exposure to sunlight. I unpacked quickly, putting away my groceries, setting up my laptop even though I had no intention of using it much. I had no cell signal out here, and the Wi-Fi was spotty at best. That was fine. I wasn't here to be online. That first night, I sat on the porch with a beer, listening to the wind in the trees. I watched the sun set, the sky turning deep orange before fading to black. It was peaceful, exactly what I had hoped for. But sometime after midnight, I woke up. The cabin was silent, but something felt off. I lay still, listening. At first, I thought it was just the unfamiliarity of the place messing with me. New environments always had a way of making sleep feel lighter. Then I heard it, a sound, faint, almost imperceptible, like something moving inside the cabin. I held my breath, listening harder. It came again, a soft creak, like wood shifting under weight. Not the kind of sound the wind makes, not the house settling. Something else, something inside. I turned on the lamp beside my bed and sat up. My heart was pounding. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the sound was nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I got up, moving carefully, listening for any other noises. I checked the main room, the kitchen, even the bathroom. Nothing. Everything was exactly as I left it. The doors were locked, the windows shut. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I went back to bed but left the lamp on. I must have drifted off eventually because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the window. I told myself I had been paranoid. First night alone in an unfamiliar place. Of course I'd feel uneasy. That's normal. The second night, I locked up just the same, made sure everything was secure before going to bed. I fell asleep faster this time, comforted by the knowledge that I had overreacted the night before. But then I woke up again. This time I heard it clearly, the sound of something shifting inside the cabin. Not just a creak, something moving. I sat up, my pulse hammering. I turned on the lamp and listened. Silence. I got out of bed, moving slower this time. I checked the main room again. The chairs at the dining table looked different. They weren't how I had left them. One was slightly pulled out, just enough to notice. I felt a cold wave run through me. I knew I hadn't touched that chair. I had eaten at the table earlier, sure, but I had pushed all the chairs in before going to bed. I was certain something was in this cabin, or had been. I checked the doors again, locked. The windows shut. No signs of forced entry. No footprints, no disturbances other than the chair. I told myself I must have misremembered. Maybe I had left it like that. Maybe I was just tired. But deep down, I knew better. I barely slept the rest of that night, jumping at every small sound. When morning came, I felt drained, but I forced myself to go about my day as usual. By the third night, I was on edge before even going to bed. I double-checked everything, made sure every door and window was secure. I even put a chair in front of the bedroom door. It was a ridiculous precaution, but it made me feel better. That night, I didn't just wake up. I was jolted awake. Something had moved in the cabin. I heard it, a sharp creak closer this time. I turned on the lamp, heart pounding. I looked toward the door. The chair I had placed in front of it had moved. Not knocked over, not pushed to the side, just moved. A few inches away from where I had placed it. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My entire body was frozen with fear. Something was in here with me. I stayed awake until dawn, barely blinking, my eyes locked on the door. When morning finally came, I packed my things without a second thought. I left the cabin that day, drove away without looking back. I didn't even bother to call the rental company, didn't care about getting my money back. I just wanted to be as far away from that place as possible. I don't know what was in there. I don't want to know, but something was, and it was watching me.